If you're enjoying the stories, there are 2 ways to support me. Members get early access and exclusive monthly content. Super thanks is right below the video if you'd prefer a one-off thanks. Now, let's start tonight's stories. How long does it take before a coincidence stops being a coincidence? That's the question I kept asking myself through the autumn and into the winter. I'd ask it on the drive to work, ask it in the shower, ask it at 2 a.m. when sleep had given up on me, and I was lying in the dark running the same sequence of events through my mind for the 4th or 5th time that week. How many times does something have to happen before you stop calling it coincidence and start calling it what it is? I'm a practical man. I don't scare easily. I don't believe in things that don't have explanations. And the explanation I kept arriving at every time I ran the sequence was the one I didn't want to arrive at. Someone knew where I was, all the time, everywhere I went. I'll start at the beginning, which is what I should have done months before I actually did. My name is Neil. I'm 46 years old. I'm a secondary school geography teacher in Inverness. Have been for about 18 years. I live in a house on the west side of the city that I bought with my ex-wife 12 years ago and kept after the divorce because she'd moved to Aberdeen, and neither of us wanted to sell at the time, and then the time passed and I stopped thinking about it. The house is far too big for one person, and I've been meaning to do something about that for about 6 years and haven't. That's a fairly accurate summary of how I approach most of the things in my life that require a decision. I mean to do something and then, the time just passes. Anyway, I have a daughter, Kirsty, who is 20 and at university in Glasgow. I love her so much. We talk on the phone twice a week and see each other in the holidays and have the kind of relationship that I think both of us know could be warmer, but neither of us quite knows how to make it so. Her mother and I didn't have a bad divorce, as divorces go, I suppose. But Kirsty was 15 when it happened, and 15 is not a good age for that kind of disruption, and I think she absorbed more of it than she's ever said. I have 2 close friends from university, both still in the Highlands, both with families. I see them when I can, which probably isn't as often as I should. I run 3 mornings a week along the river, or I did until the thing I'm about to tell you made running alone feel different than it used to. I know I'm rambling, but I'm telling you all of this because I want you to understand the specific texture of my life before it happened. Ordinary, quiet, structured around work and small pleasures and the gentle, accumulated routines of a man living alone in a house that's slightly too large for him. Not a life with obvious drama in it. Not a life where you'd expect something like this to arrive. The first thing was in August, a Saturday morning, early. One of those Highland August mornings where the light comes in low and golden, and the mist is still sitting on the river, and the city feels half asleep. I was running my usual route, along the riverbank, past the suspension bridge, up through the Ness Islands, back along the east side. And as I came off the islands and onto the path, I had the sudden, very specific sensation of being watched. I don't mean a vague unease. I mean something precise and physical, a prickling across the back of my neck that made me slow down and look around. There was nobody obviously watching me. A couple of dog walkers in the distance, a jogger coming the other way who passed me without acknowledgement. Nothing wrong. I put it down to tiredness. I'd slept badly that week and ran home and forgot about it. A week later, I was in a coffee shop in the city centre I used most Saturday mornings, reading the paper. And when I looked up from the paper, there was a man at a table near the window who was looking at his phone. Nothing remarkable about that. But when I looked again a few minutes later, he was still there, and the angle of his phone held slightly high, screen not obviously active, was the angle of someone taking a photograph rather than reading something. I looked directly at him and he lowered the phone and looked out of the window. And I told myself I was imagining things and drank my coffee and left. The third thing was the most specific, and it's the one that I should have acted on immediately and didn't. I was in a car park near Loch Ness on a Sunday afternoon in September. A place I went occasionally to walk. Nothing regular, not part of any routine. Just a spontaneous drive out. I'd been there for about 20 minutes when a grey car pulled into the car park and parked at the far end. The driver didn't get out, just sat there. I wasn't paying close attention. I was looking at the lock, not the car park. But when I came back to my car an hour later, the grey car was still there, still occupied. And as I drove out of the car park, it pulled out a few seconds after me. I lost sight of it within a mile and told myself that two cars leaving a car park at similar times was not a story. In retrospect, I was working very hard to not see what was in front of me. The fourth thing was what broke it open. It was October, a Tuesday evening, and I'd stayed late at the school to mark a set of assessments and then driven to a supermarket on the retail park outside the city, which I didn't normally use. I had a local one I used most weeks, but I needed something they didn't stock. I was in the supermarket for about 40 minutes. When I came out and got back to my car, there was a piece of paper under the windscreen wiper. Not a flyer, not a parking notice. A folded piece of white paper with my name on it. Just my first name, Neil. I stood in the car park in the dark and looked at it for a moment before I opened it. Inside, in neat block capitals, it said, "I know you've noticed. It's fine. Just checking in. That's all." No signature, no number, no explanation. I stood there for what was probably 30 seconds but felt much longer, and I looked around the car park and there was no one paying any attention to me. Just shoppers loading bags into boots and a couple of teenagers on bikes near the entrance. Then I got in my car and drove home and sat at my kitchen table and looked at the piece of paper for a long time. Just checking in. The phrasing is what made it so horrible. Not threatening, not obscene, friendly almost. The kind of thing you'd text a friend you hadn't spoken to in a while. The deliberate casualness of it, pressed against the absolute abnormality of what it represented, was the most frightening thing about it. This was not a person who was unaware of how disturbing this was. This was a person who understood exactly how disturbing it was and was enjoying the specificity of it. I rang the police that evening. I want to be clear that I did that I didn't wait, didn't try to handle it quietly. Rang 101 and reported it, and gave the officer I spoke to the note and the details of everything I'd noticed since August. He took a report, and I was told someone would be in touch. I was in touch with a detective constable within 2 days, a woman who was thorough and took it seriously, and told me to keep a log of anything further and not to approach anyone I suspected of following me. I asked her directly whether she thought I was actually being followed, or whether this was more likely a one-off. She said she couldn't make that assessment yet, but that the note suggested organized intent rather than opportunistic behavior. She said it in a way that was clearly intended to be measured and which had the opposite of its intended effect. While the police were doing what they were doing, I did what I probably shouldn't have done, which was try to understand it myself. Not by approaching anyone or doing anything physically. I'm not a reckless person. But by trying to think through how someone could know where I was, consistently enough that the car park encounter had the quality of something planned. How they'd have my name. What the mechanism was. I thought about my routines. My social media. I had accounts on the usual platforms, used them mildly, not set to private in any deliberate way. I thought about whether I'd made any new contacts recently, online or in person, who I didn't know well enough to trust. I thought about the running route and the coffee shop, and whether I'd shared either of those things anywhere that could be seen by someone I didn't know. And then I thought about the app. About 4 months before August, I downloaded a local community app, one of those neighborhood platforms that had become popular in the area, used for selling things, reporting local issues, organizing community events. I'd registered with my full name and a profile photograph because that's what the sign-up process encouraged, and I hadn't thought about it. The app showed your approximate location when you posted, and I'd posted on it several times, about a planning application near the school, about a lost cat notice someone had asked me to share, a few other minor things, nothing that seemed significant. The app also had a feature I hadn't paid much attention to, a map function that showed members' locations in real time when they were using the app. I'd had location services on. I checked the app settings and saw that the location sharing had been turned on by default, and I'd never turned it off. So anyone on that app could see in real time where I was whenever I had the app open, which was fairly often because it sent notifications I'd been clicking, and I'd posted enough that my profile, with my name and photograph, was visible to anyone who looked. I turned the location sharing off and rang the detective constable and told her what I'd found. What she found, working with a technical specialist over the following weeks, was worse than a stranger on a community app. I'll give you what I understand of it, which is not complete because some of it was never shared with me in full, and some of it I've chosen not to know in full detail. What they established was that my profile on the app had been accessed repeatedly by an account that had been created specifically to access it, an account with a false name and a stock profile photograph, registered with a disposable email address, using the community app for no purpose other than monitoring my location. The account had been checking my profile, and on the days I'd had the app open, my real-time location, multiple times a day for approximately 3 months. 3 months of knowing where I was. 3 months of, occasionally, being where I was. The detective constable told me this with the careful manner of someone who has thought about how to deliver information like this and has landed on directness as the least damaging option. I appreciated that. I sat in her office and she told me about the account and about what they'd been able to trace from it, which connected to a forum. I'd heard about this kind of thing. I wasn't completely ignorant, but hearing about it in the context of your own life, applied to your own name and photograph, makes it concrete in a way that general awareness doesn't. The forum was organized around the targeting of specific individuals, not randomly, deliberately selected, researched, surveilled, documented. The members shared methods, tools, targets. There were threads dedicated to individuals, threads containing photographs taken without knowledge, location data, schedules, personal details assembled through public sources, and through exactly the kind of application vulnerability that had been exploited in my case. The threads were not organized around any obvious motivation that the police could clearly articulate to me. They weren't extortion threads or stalking for hire threads. They appeared to be organized around the activity itself. The accumulation, the watching, the note on the windscreen, just checking in, fit a pattern the forum had documented across multiple targets, a signature almost, a way of letting the person know they'd been seen without revealing anything about who was doing the seeing. I was not the only active target in Scotland. I was not the most extensively documented. That last piece of information was given to me by the detective constable in the same direct manner as the rest of it, and I sat with it for a moment and then asked what it meant for me practically. She said the investigation was active and she couldn't go into detail. She said the threat level to me specifically had been assessed, and I should take reasonable precautions, which she outlined. She gave me a number to ring if anything further happened. The practical precautions are things I now do without thinking about them much, because they become habit. I've tightened every privacy setting on every account I have. I no longer use location services on any application. I vary my running route. I don't sit with my back to a room in the coffee shop anymore. I moved to a corner table the week after the detective constable's office, and I haven't moved back. These things take seconds and cost nothing, and I'm aware that they are also a form of ongoing disruption. A daily reminder that my ordinary life was accessed and used by someone I've never identified. The man in the coffee shop, the grey car at the loch, the note. I think about whether I'm right that these were all the same person, and I think I probably am, but I can't be certain. I think about the note's phrasing, just checking in, and what it was intended to produce in me. Whether it was designed to frighten, or to demonstrate capability, or simply to make contact, to let me know that the watching was real, and that I knew it, and they knew I knew it. The detective constable said, when I asked her this, that motivation in these cases was often not what you'd expect, and that trying to understand it from the outside was not always useful. I think about Kirsty. She was on the same community app. I asked her, in a careful way that I hope didn't alarm her, to check her settings, and she did, and she'd had location sharing on as well. And I stayed on the phone with her until she turned it off, and then I rang the detective constable and mentioned it, and she noted it. I don't know if Kirsty appeared in any thread. I've chosen not to ask that question directly. Some things you don't want confirmed. The investigation produced an arrest about 4 months after I first made the report. I was told this, and told that there would be a process, and that I'd be kept informed. I've been kept informed at intervals, in the careful language of ongoing proceedings. I don't know when it will end. I've stopped expecting a clean conclusion. What I've been thinking about instead, and this is the thing I keep returning to, on the drive to work, in the shower, at 2 in the morning when sleep goes again, is the gap. The 3 months between the first thing, the run along the river in August, and the note on the windscreen in October. 3 months of being watched, being photographed, being tracked across a city by someone who was documenting it for an audience I still don't fully understand. 3 months of a life going about its normal business, teaching, running, marking assessments, thinking about nothing particularly important, while someone was watching all of it and filing it carefully away. I don't know what they were looking for. I don't know what I represented to whoever started the thread, what quality or characteristic or piece of simple visibility made me worth that kind of sustained attention. I was just a man going about his days, that's all. That turns out to be enough. The question I keep asking, how long before coincidence stops being coincidence? I now know the answer, or at least my answer, which is the first time. The very first time, the prickling at the back of the neck on the river path in August. That was the answer. The thing that felt like nothing was already something, had already been something for a while before I felt it. And every time I told myself I was imagining things, I was choosing comfort over accuracy. I don't make that choice anymore. That's the thing that has changed most and is permanent, and I'm still working out whether to call it damage or education. Some mornings, running along the river, I still feel it, that specific prickling. I still look around. There's usually nothing there. Dog walkers, the har on the water, the city waking up around me. Usually. been asked more than once why I chose care work. It's one of those questions that sounds simple until you try to answer it honestly. The polite version is that I wanted to make a difference, that I'd always been the sort of person who noticed when someone needed help and felt compelled to do something about it. The honest version is that I think I was drawn to it because it gave structure to something in me I didn't fully understand. This need to be useful, to have my presence matter to someone in a concrete way. I was 31 when I started, newly out of a long relationship, living alone for the first time in years, in a flat above a chip shop on the seafront in Whitby that smelled of vinegar and salt, and which I grew to love in the way you grow to love things that are slightly wrong for you. Whitby suited me. People come there for the ruins and the harbour and the fish, and the people who actually live there develop a particular self-sufficiency, a tolerance for grey weather and tourist seasons, and the specific loneliness of a place that is always full of visitors but never feels crowded. I'd grown up further down the coast, near Scarborough, and moving to Whitby felt like coming sideways rather than back, which was exactly what I needed at the time. I worked for a domiciliary care agency covering the older streets above the harbour and the villages along the coast road. My clients were mostly elderly, people in their 70s and 80s living alone in houses too large for them, managing on pensions, keeping their pride intact by refusing to admit how much they needed. I did their shopping, helped with personal care where required, sat with them for the allotted time and sometimes longer when I could manage it. I was good at it, not because of any particular training beyond the mandatory certificates, but because I was patient and I listened and I didn't treat the work as a transaction. That's not self-congratulation. It's just that it was the right fit, and those fits are rare enough that you notice them. I had 17 clients on my regular rota. Maurice was not one of them originally. He came through a handover from a colleague who was leaving the agency, a woman called Denise, who'd covered his visits for 2 years and who said, when she passed him on, that he was private and I shouldn't take it personally if he seemed unfriendly at first. She said it in a way that suggested she hadn't entirely resolved the unfriendliness herself. The house was on the edge of Runswick, about 6 miles up the coast. It sat apart from the main cluster of cottages, closer to the cliff edge than planning would probably allow today, with a view over the North Sea that on clear days was extraordinary, and on bad days, most days, October through March, was an unbroken grey wall of cloud and moving water. Maurice was 78. He'd had a mild stroke the previous spring that had affected his left side and made certain daily tasks difficult. His wife had died 4 years earlier. He had a daughter in Edinburgh who rang on Sundays and visited at Christmas and believed, as far as I could tell, that he was managing fine. He was not managing fine. The house wasn't dirty exactly, but it had the quality of a space that had given up being cared for. Surfaces filmed with dust, curtains not quite drawn properly, a kitchen that smelled of meals eaten standing at the counter. He moved around it carefully, as though the stroke had made him mistrust his own body, and when I arrived, he looked at me with an expression that was not quite hostility and not quite welcome. Assessment is the word that came to mind then, and is the word that comes to mind now, though I understand it differently. I made him a cup of tea, found where things lived without asking, sat across from him and let the quiet settle, then asked what he'd been reading. There was a book on the arm of his chair, a history of Yorkshire's fishing industry, dense with photographs. He looked at it, then at me, and something shifted slightly in his expression. Not warmth, the beginning of the possibility of warmth. That was October. By December we had a routine. The first indication came in November, about 3 weeks in. I arrived on a Thursday morning to find him agitated in a way I hadn't seen before. Not distressed, but keyed up. Alert in a way that seemed misplaced in a man who usually moved through his days at a measured pace. He was at his desk when I came in. The desk was in the small room off the main sitting room that he'd never invited me into, and the door was ajar, and he closed it behind him when he came out with a speed that he clearly hoped I wouldn't notice. I noticed. I said nothing. Clients are entitled to their private spaces. I made his tea, and we talked about the weather and about a seal he'd seen from the window that week, and the agitation settled, and by the time I left, he seemed like himself again. But I thought about the closed door on the drive back, and I thought about it again the following Tuesday, when I found him tired in a specific way. Not the tiredness of age or recovery, but the tiredness of someone who hasn't slept because they've been doing something through the night. His eyes had a depletion I recognized from people who'd sat up with something troubling. When I asked if he'd slept, he said yes, fine, with the reflexive ease of a man who had decided before I arrived what his answers to certain questions would be. In December, I arrived to find the door to the small room open. He'd forgotten to close it, or hadn't had time. He was in the kitchen when I came in, and I had perhaps 3 seconds in which I could see the desk and what was on the monitor before I moved past into the kitchen. 3 seconds was enough. The monitor was large, newer than anything else in the house, which I'd registered before without thinking about it. And what was on the screen was a dense, threaded interface, dark backgrounded, the kind of structure you don't associate with ordinary browsing. I couldn't read specific content in 3 seconds, but I could read the register of it, the shape of it, and I knew with a certainty that settled in my stomach like cold water that whatever I was looking at was not a fishing history forum or anything else with an innocent explanation. I said nothing, made his tea, sat with him for the allotted time. On the drive home, I turned the image over and tried to talk myself out of what I'd concluded and couldn't do it. The decision I made over the next few weeks is one I've examined from every angle since. I decided to watch, not to report, not to raise it with the agency, not to ask Morris directly, but to pay careful attention over time before doing anything. Part of that was professional caution. Part of it, I'll admit, was something less creditable, a reluctance to make an accusation against a vulnerable elderly man and have it turn out to be nothing, to become the carer who raised a fuss and got it wrong. There is always an innocent explanation, right up until there isn't. January was when the pattern became something I couldn't keep rationalizing away. His sleeping was worse. I could see it in his face each week, a progressive depletion he kept denying. He became occasionally animated in a way that felt disconnected from whatever we were talking about, a brightness that seemed to come from somewhere else, something private bleeding through before he could contain it. And twice. Once in the second week of January, once in the last, I arrived to find him coming out of the small room, pulling the door shut behind him, with an expression that had almost resolved itself into welcome by the time he crossed the hallway, but hadn't quite finished doing so. That fraction of a second, that's what I kept coming back to on the drive home. In February, I came 10 minutes early, a cancelled prior visit, plausible enough that he had no reason to question it. The small room door was open. He was at the desk with his back to me, the monitor bright in the grey morning light, and I stood in the doorway for 5 seconds before he heard me and turned. 5 seconds is long enough. The forum was dark backgrounded, dense with nested threads. I recognized the structure before I understood the content. The same shape I'd seen in December, the same register. But this time I was still and looking rather than walking past, and this time I could read more of it. There were thumbnail images along the margins of the screen, small enough that their content wasn't immediately clear enough when I looked at them, that my body understood before my mind did. A coldness moving outward from my chest, my hands going still, and in the center of the screen a thread, long and active, written in the chatty and casually interested tone of people sharing opinions on something they had watched together and were looking forward to watching again. Maurice turned around. We looked at each other. I walked out, sat in the car with my hands on the steering wheel while the sea sat grey and enormous 20 meters away, and I rang the agency, and then I rang the police and waited on hold for 11 minutes and described what I'd seen, while my voice did things I couldn't entirely control. What the police found when they came the following morning with a warrant was more extensive than I'd imagined. The small room held not just the main computer, but 2 older laptops stacked under the desk and an external hard drive, all connected through a switching device that let him move between them. The forum on the main screen was one of several he used. The investigators described them in the careful language they used to avoid saying the actual thing directly, as communities organized around content recorded without subjects' knowledge or consent. People filmed in private spaces, in their homes, in moments where they believed themselves unobserved. Some of it was voyeuristic, some of it was considerably worse than that. And then there was the camera. It was in the sitting room, on a shelf among ornaments, a small black device I had walked past dozens of times without registering it as anything other than part of the room's ordinary clutter. I learned about it 4 weeks later from the officer who'd taken my original statement. She told me in measured language that among the material recovered from Maurice's devices were recordings made through windows, through gaps in curtains, and from that shelf, recordings of me over the course of my visits, going about my work in his home. He had been recording me since mid-November at the earliest, possibly earlier. The camera had been positioned to capture the sitting room and the hallway, which meant it captured me every visit, coming in, taking my coat off, moving between rooms, sitting across from him, and talking about fishing books and seals and whether he'd slept. 3 months of visits, captured, and then, because this is the part I have to say plainly, even though I'd rather not, shared on the forum. Not all of it. The investigators believed a portion of it had been posted to one of the threads, offered up to the same people who gathered there to discuss and rate and request, served alongside whatever else they had come to consume that week. A woman doing her job, making an old man's tea, believing herself to be in a private and professional arrangement. That is what I was, on those threads. Content. What lodged in me most deeply, and it's still there, it hasn't shifted, was a text document they found in a folder on his desktop. Notes. His own notes, written and updated over months in a precise and methodical way that the investigators said was consistent with someone who had spent a career in quantity surveying, in the careful documentation of specifics. The notes were about me, times of arrival, routes I seemed to take, which visits were solo and which overlapped with another carer, what I wore on particular days. Physical details I am not going to repeat here. Observations about my habits and patterns and the small repeated gestures people have without knowing they have them. 11 pages. I've sat with that number more times than I can count. 11 pages of a retired man's careful attention, written while I drove back to my flat and ate my dinner and thought I understood what my weeks contained. He had been watching me with the same organized interest he brought to the forum. The same methodology, the same patience, the same accumulation of detail. The online activity and the real-world attention weren't separate things. They were the same thing. The forum had given him a framework and an appetite, and I had walked into his house and become, without knowing it, part of what he fed it with. He was charged. The case moved through the system slowly. He received a suspended sentence, attributed partly to his age and his health and his circumstances, which I was told about in a letter I read once and placed in a drawer. The agency offered counseling. I went for a while. The other carers were kind in the way people are kind. When something frightening has happened to someone near them and they don't know what to say, which is to say they were kind but also slightly relieved it hadn't happened to them. I still live in Whitby. I still do the work, though with a different agency now and in a different part of the coast. Leaving felt like being pushed out of my own life, and I'd already had enough taken without volunteering more. What I haven't got back, and I'm not being dramatic, this is just accurate, is the ease I used to have in other people's houses. That unself-consciousness, the ability to move through a client's space and just be in it, present and uncomplicated. I check shelves now. I notice objects I wouldn't have noticed before. I am aware of angles and sightlines and what a room looks like to someone who might be watching it rather than living in it. I think about what can be seen from a window and whether a device left out in the open is what it appears to be, and what a small black object on a shelf might be doing there. Those thoughts are automatic now. They happen before I've decided to have them. The other thing that's changed is harder to put into words, but I'll try. When I sit with a client now and we talk about their reading, about the weather, about whatever ordinary thing fills the time, I am aware in a way I wasn't before of the gap between what a person shows you and what they're actually like. Maurice was good at being a certain kind of person in the hour I spent with him each visit. Patient, private, gradually warming. He asked about my drive over, remembered things I'd mentioned the previous week. He seemed, honestly, like someone I was helping. And somewhere in the same house, in the small room with the door pulled shut, was 11 pages of notes and a camera on a shelf and a screen full of things I cannot fully think about even now without the cold coming back. I went back once to Runswick, parked at the top of the track and sat looking at the sea rather than the house, trying to understand how a man with that view, that quiet, whatever good years he had left arranged around him, how he'd spent his nights looking for the worst things one person can seek out about another, looking for them and finding them, finding a community that wanted what he wanted and would give him more of it, and then looking up from the screen and seeing a woman come to make his tea and thinking, whatever he thought. I don't know what he thought. That's the part I keep returning to, the gap I can't cross. You can document a person's behavior and still not reach whatever is at the center of it. Some people are arranged around something you will never be able to see directly, something they have learned to keep covered, and they are very good at it, and they look just like everyone else, and they make you tea in return. I still ask clients what they're reading. I still think it matters. It still tells you something real. It just doesn't tell you enough. Looking back, I can pinpoint the exact moment everything started to go wrong, but I still can't explain why I didn't see it coming. Maybe that's just how these things work. You don't recognize danger until you're already caught up in it. This happened about 10 months ago when I was living in Birmingham, working as a veterinary nurse at a small practice in Moseley. The job was demanding but rewarding, lots of long days, but I genuinely enjoyed the work. I'd been there for about 3 years, had a decent little flat near Cannon Hill Park, and life was generally ticking along without any major complications. I've never been particularly tech-savvy, but I'm not completely hopeless either. I can navigate the internet well enough, understand basic privacy settings, that sort of thing. So when I read an article about the dark web one evening, I wasn't entirely clueless about what it was. The article was talking about how journalists and activists used it to communicate safely in countries with oppressive governments, how it wasn't all illegal marketplaces and criminal activity, like the media often portrayed it. The article mentioned that ordinary people could access it fairly easily, that it wasn't this incredibly complex thing requiring specialist knowledge. Out of curiosity more than anything else, I looked into how to do it, found some straightforward instructions, followed them, and within maybe 20 minutes I was browsing this completely different version of the internet. Most of it was boring, honestly. Pages that wouldn't load properly, sites that looked like they'd been designed 15 years ago and never updated, broken links everywhere. I spent an hour or so clicking around, not finding anything particularly interesting. There were some marketplaces that looked obviously dodgy, a few discussion boards I had no interest in, and a lot of dead ends. Then I found something called the Witness program. It was listed on one of those directory pages that catalog dark websites. The description was brief. Help provide testimony for those who cannot speak for themselves. Confidential, anonymous, essential. When I clicked through, the page that loaded was plain but well designed. Black background, white text, a simple logo showing an eye. The homepage explained what the program was about, and it sounded genuinely noble. Essentially, it was a platform designed to collect witness testimonies about crimes and injustices that couldn't be reported through official channels. The site explained that many people around the world witnessed terrible things but couldn't come forward because of fear, corruption, lack of access to legitimate authorities, or various other reasons. The Witness program aimed to document these testimonies anonymously, creating a permanent record that could potentially be used for justice in the future. The site emphasized that witnesses remain completely anonymous. No real names, no identifying information, just accounts of what people had seen or experienced. The testimonies were stored securely and could be accessed by verified human rights organizations, journalists, and legal professionals who might be able to use them to build cases or expose wrongdoing. It all seemed legitimate and important. There was a button at the bottom. Submit your testimony. I didn't have anything to submit. I'd never witnessed any serious crimes or injustices. But I was curious about what the process looked like, so I clicked through anyway. A form appeared asking for basic information about the incident you wanted to report. Date, location, type of incident. A detailed description of what you witnessed. There were drop-down menus for categorizing the testimony: human rights violations, corruption, assault, theft, environmental crimes, and various other options. At the bottom was a field for providing contact information if you wanted to receive updates, though the site stressed this was entirely optional. I closed the form without filling anything in. I had nothing to report, and I wasn't going to make something up just to see how the system worked. But as I was about to close the browser, I noticed another link at the bottom of the page. Become a witness validator. I clicked it. The page explained that the program needed volunteers to help verify and categorize submitted testimonies. Because the system allowed anonymous submissions, there was a risk of false reports or spam. Validators would review testimonies, assess whether they seemed credible, and help organize them appropriately so they could be useful to the organizations that accessed them. The page stressed that validators never had access to identifying information about witnesses. Everything remained anonymous. Validators simply read testimonies and provided their assessment of credibility completeness, and relevance. Each validation earned points, and volunteers who accumulated enough points could receive recognition for their contribution to documenting human rights abuses and supporting justice. It sounded like something I could actually help with. I had no useful skills for activism or advocacy, but I could read testimonies and provide honest assessments. It seemed like a small but meaningful way to contribute to something important. I registered using a temporary email address. The process was simple. A few questions about languages I spoke, regions I was familiar with, any relevant experience or knowledge. I put down English, UK, and mentioned my work as a veterinary nurse, since some testimonies might involve animal welfare. Then I submitted the registration and was taken to a dashboard. The interface was clean and straightforward. At the top was my point balance, 0. Below that was a list of pending testimonies waiting for validation. Each one showed a reference number, a date, and a brief category label. There were dozens of them. I clicked on the first one. The testimony appeared in a simple text box. It was written in English, describing an incident of workplace harassment. The person writing it explained they'd witnessed their manager verbally abusing an employee over several weeks, creating a hostile environment, but the company's HR department had dismissed complaints. The testimony was detailed and specific, including dates and descriptions of particular incidents. Below the testimony were several questions I needed to answer. Does this testimony appear credible? Yes, possibly unclear no. Is the testimony sufficiently detailed? Yes, partially no. Is the testimony relevant to the stated category? Yes, partially no. Does the testimony require follow-up or additional information? Yes, no. I read through the testimony again carefully. It seemed genuine. The details were consistent, the writing style was natural, and nothing about it raised obvious red flags. I marked it as credible, sufficiently detailed, and relevant. Didn't think it needed follow-up since the account was fairly complete. Then I submitted my validation. My point balance increased slightly. A new testimony appeared. This one was different. Written in broken English, describing what sounded like labor exploitation in a factory somewhere in Eastern Europe. The details were vague, the timeline unclear, but the emotional tone felt genuine. I marked it as possibly credible, partially detailed, relevant, but requiring additional information. Another testimony appeared, then another, then another. Most were fairly mundane, honestly. Workplace disputes, minor corruption, petty theft. Things that were unpleasant but not shocking. I spent maybe an hour going through them, providing my assessments, earning points slowly. Then I came across one that made me pause. The testimony described witnessing an assault, a serious one, with enough detail that it made me uncomfortable to read. The person writing it explained they'd seen someone being attacked in a car park late at night, that the victim had been badly hurt, and that the witness had been too frightened to intervene or report it to police. The testimony included descriptions of the attacker, the victim, the location, the approximate date. I sat staring at the screen for a while. This wasn't workplace harassment or minor corruption. This was a violent crime, and someone had witnessed it but hadn't reported it, and now they were telling their story to this anonymous platform instead. I marked it as credible, sufficiently detailed and relevant, added a note suggesting it should be flagged for organizations that dealt with violent crime. Then I submitted the validation and tried not to think too much about what I just read. I kept validating testimonies over the next few days. Did maybe an hour or two each evening, working through the backlog, earning points steadily. Most testimonies were relatively minor things, but occasionally I'd come across something more serious. assaults, thefts, fraud, abuse. Each time, I try to assess them objectively, provide honest evaluations, and move on. After about a week, my point balance had reached around 500. I noticed a notification at the top of my dashboard. You are now eligible for priority validation tasks. These testimonies require experienced validators and earn additional points. There was a button, Access Priority Tasks. I clicked it. A new list of testimonies appeared, and immediately I could see these were different. The first one I opened described witnessing a murder, an actual murder, described in disturbing detail. The witness explained they'd been in the wrong place at the wrong time, had seen something they weren't supposed to see, and had been living in fear ever since. The testimony included specific information about the location, the people involved, the circumstances. It read like something that should be in a police report, not on an anonymous website. I marked it as credible. What else could I do? The details were too specific to be fabricated. The fear in the writing felt genuine. I submitted the validation and moved to the next testimony. More serious crimes, more disturbing accounts, witnesses describing things they'd seen that had clearly traumatized them, things they claimed they couldn't report through official channels for various reasons: corrupt police, fear of retaliation, immigration status, involvement in illegal activities themselves. The testimonies were increasingly detailed. Locations were specific, often down to street names and landmarks. Descriptions of people involved included physical features, clothing, sometimes even names. Dates and times were precise. I kept validating them because that's what I'd signed up to do. Each one earned me more points. Each one felt more serious than the last. Then I came across a testimony that mentioned Birmingham. It described a violent incident that had allegedly occurred in Digbeth about 2 months earlier. The witness claimed to have seen a group of men attacking someone near the railway arches, that the victim had been badly beaten and left unconscious, that the witness had fled before police arrived. I read through it twice. The location was specific enough that I could picture it. I'd been to that area before, though not recently. The description of the incident was detailed and consistent. Nothing about it seemed obviously false. I marked it as credible and submitted my validation. More testimonies appeared mentioning Birmingham. Different locations, different incidents, but all local. Some I recognized the places mentioned, others I didn't. All claimed to describe serious crimes, assaults, robberies, drug deals gone wrong. All allegedly witnessed by people who hadn't reported them to police. I started wondering why so many testimonies were suddenly from Birmingham. Coincidence? Or was the system somehow showing me testimonies relevant to my location because I'd mentioned UK in my registration? Then I got a testimony that made my stomach drop. It described an incident near Cannon Hill Park, my park, the one I walk through regularly. According to the testimony, someone had witnessed a woman being followed by a man as she walked home one evening, about 3 weeks earlier. The witness claimed the man had been acting suspiciously, maintaining distance but clearly tracking the woman's movements. The witness had considered intervening, but had been uncertain whether they were misreading the situation. They'd watched the woman reach her building safely, then seen the man stand outside for several minutes before leaving. The description of the location was extremely specific. The building was described in enough detail that I was fairly certain it was mine. The date mentioned was a Tuesday evening 3 weeks ago. I walked home through that park most Tuesday evenings after my late shift. I tried to tell myself it was coincidence. Lots of women walked through that park. Lots of buildings in the area matched the description. It didn't have to be about me. but the details kept matching up. The time was right, the day was right. Even the description of the woman was vague enough that it could have been me. Average height, dark coat, carrying a bag. I marked the testimony as credible because I couldn't think of any reason to doubt it. If someone really had witnessed this and thought they'd seen something suspicious, their testimony seemed genuine. Then I submitted the validation and sat there feeling cold. Someone had been following me 3 weeks ago, and someone else had witnessed it happening. And now I was reading about it on a dark website. I checked the date stamp on the testimony. It had been submitted 2 days ago. Whoever witnessed this had waited 3 weeks before reporting it anonymously to this platform. Over the next few days, more testimonies appeared mentioning the same area. Different incidents, different dates, but all near Cannon Hill Park or the surrounding streets. Someone witnessing suspicious behavior near the entrance to my building. Someone seeing a person sitting in a parked car outside for extended periods. Someone noticing the same individual walking past the same locations repeatedly over several days. Each testimony was written by a different anonymous witness. Each described something that seemed innocuous on its own, but felt threatening when combined with the others. And I was the one validating them, marking them as credible, confirming that yes, these testimonies seemed genuine. Yes, they were sufficiently detailed. Yes, they were relevant to their stated categories. I started paying more attention to my surroundings, looking for people who seemed to be watching or following me, checking if anyone was sitting in parked cars near my building, taking different routes home, varying my schedule. I didn't see anything obviously suspicious, but then the testimonies suggested the surveillance had been subtle enough that witnesses had been uncertain whether they were really seeing something wrong. Then a new type of testimony started appearing. These ones were different in tone. Instead of describing incidents they'd witnessed, they were describing people they'd seen. Detailed descriptions of individuals, including what they were wearing, where they'd been seen, what they'd been doing. One of them described me. I'm certain of it. Average height, dark hair, works in veterinary medicine, lives near Cannon Hill Park, usually walks home around 8 on Tuesday evenings. The testimony claimed to have seen this person exhibiting suspicious behavior, though it didn't specify what that behavior was. I was being documented, catalogued. Multiple anonymous witnesses were submitting testimonies about me, and I was validating them alongside dozens of other testimonies, confirming they seemed credible and detailed. I tried to stop validating, logged out of the dashboard, and didn't go back for several days. But I couldn't stop thinking about those testimonies, about who was submitting them and why. When I finally logged back in, my dashboard had been updated. There was a new section, testimonies requiring your attention. Inside were dozens of testimonies, all flagged as priority, all mentioning Birmingham, all describing incidents near my home. And there was a message at the top. As a validator familiar with this region, your input on these testimonies is particularly valuable. Please review and validate at your earliest convenience. They knew where I lived, not just the general area, but specifically. They were assigning me testimonies about my own neighborhood, about incidents I might have witnessed, about surveillance of places I frequented. I went through the testimonies mechanically, each one describing something that had allegedly been witnessed near my home. People loitering, cars parked suspiciously, someone trying door handles on my street late at night, a person photographing buildings including mine. Each testimony was dated within the past few weeks. Each was submitted by a different anonymous witness, and each was detailed enough to be credible, specific enough to be verifiable, disturbing enough to be frightening. I validated them all because I didn't know what else to do. Marked them as credible, as detailed, as relevant. Then I submitted the validations and watched my point balance increase. The next day, I noticed someone outside my building. A woman, maybe in her 40s, standing on the pavement across the street. She was looking at her phone, but her attention kept drifting to my building. She stood there for maybe 20 minutes before walking away. That evening, a new testimony appeared. It described witnessing a woman standing outside a building near Cannon Hill Park, appearing to watch the entrance. The testimony noted the date and time. That afternoon, the description of the woman matched the person I'd seen. I hadn't submitted that testimony. I'd witnessed it, but I hadn't reported it. Someone else had, which meant there were multiple people watching my building. Some of them were the ones being watched. Others were the ones doing the watching and reporting what they saw. More testimonies appeared over the following days, each describing activity around my neighborhood, each mentioning dates and times that corresponded with my own observations. Sometimes the testimonies described things I'd seen. Sometimes they described things I hadn't noticed, but that had allegedly happened nearby. Then testimonies started appearing that described me specifically, not just vague descriptions that might match dozens of people, but specific details. My work schedule, the practice where I worked, my car, including the make and color, routes I regularly walked, shops I visited. Each testimony claimed to have witnessed me exhibiting concerning behavior, returning to the same locations repeatedly, speaking to people in suspicious circumstances, carrying items that seemed unusual. None of it was true, but the testimonies were written convincingly enough that they seemed credible, and I was still validating them, still marking them as detailed and relevant, still contributing to this documentation of my own life being compiled by anonymous witnesses. I tried to delete my account. The option wasn't available. I looked through every settings page, every menu option. There was no way to remove my account or stop receiving validation tasks. I sent a message through the site's contact system, demanding they remove my information. No response came. The testimonies kept appearing. More details about me, more specific information about my movements, my habits, my routines, all submitted anonymously by witnesses who claimed to have seen suspicious behavior. Then testimonies started appearing that described things that hadn't happened yet, predictions of where I would be seen next, suggestions of what behavior I might exhibit in the future, recommendations for how witnesses should respond if they encountered me. Someone was planning something, using this platform to coordinate surveillance, to document my life, to build a narrative that I was somehow suspicious or dangerous. I went to the police, told them people were following me, documenting my movements, posting about me online. They asked for evidence. I tried to explain about the dark website, about the testimonies, about the validation system. They looked at me like I was paranoid. They said they'd make a note of my concerns, but there wasn't much they could do without concrete evidence of harassment or threats. They suggested I keep a diary of suspicious incidents, maybe install a camera, consider speaking to a mental health professional if the anxiety became overwhelming. I moved out of Birmingham 2 months later, found a job at a practice in Coventry, got a flat in a completely different area. Didn't tell anyone where I was going except my new employer. For a few weeks, everything seemed fine. No testimonies appeared mentioning my new location. The validation tasks I received were about other places, other people. I started to relax. Then a testimony appeared describing someone matching my description being seen in Coventry. working at a veterinary practice, living in a specific neighborhood, exhibiting the same suspicious patterns of behavior that had been documented in Birmingham. They'd found me again. More testimonies appeared. My new address, my new routine, my new regular locations, all being documented by anonymous witnesses, all being validated by volunteers who had no idea they were contributing to organized surveillance, volunteers like I had been. I stopped logging into the site, but the damage was done. My information was in their system. My life was being documented by dozens of anonymous witnesses, all submitting testimonies that painted me as suspicious, as dangerous, as someone who needed to be watched. And somewhere, other validators were reading those testimonies and marking them as credible, just like I'd done, contributing to a system they didn't understand, helping to document people they'd never met, building cases against individuals for reasons they couldn't comprehend. I don't know who's behind the witness program. I don't know what they want or why I was targeted. I don't know if I'm the only one or if there are others being documented the same way. What I know is that I helped build the system that's now being used against me. Every testimony I validated, every assessment I provided, I was training myself and others to accept these accounts as credible, to treat anonymous witnesses as reliable, to document people's lives without question. And now those same mechanisms are being used to document mine. I've moved 3 more times since Coventry. Each time, within days, testimonies appeared describing my new location. Each time, the documentation starts again. The witnesses multiply. The details accumulate. I can't escape it because I can't escape witnesses. Anyone could be one. Anyone could be watching, documenting, submitting testimonies about me to that platform. The woman at the bus stop, the man in the car park, the person walking their dog past my building. Anyone. The photograph is still on my mantelpiece. I haven't moved it, and I'm not going to, because removing it would feel like a kind of defeat, like allowing what happened to reach back and erase something it has no right to touch. It's a picture of my late husband Gerald and me on the Pembrokeshire coastal path, taken by a stranger we'd handed our camera to somewhere above St. Bride's Bay. Gerald is squinting into the sun, and I am laughing at something he'd said a moment before the shutter clicked, and the sea behind us is that particular shade of blue that only happens on the best Welsh summer days, the kind of blue that seems too vivid to be real. We look happy because we were happy. 31 years of marriage, and that is still one of my favorite photographs of us. I keep it there because I refuse to let what came after take it from me. That's where I need to start. With Gerald and with Wales, and with the particular shape my life had taken by the time I was 67 and living alone in a stone cottage outside Aberaeron on the Ceredigion coast. Gerald died 4 years before any of this happened. A cardiac event, that's the phrase the doctors used, which always struck me as oddly neutral for something so absolute. He was in the garden when it happened. In May, the roses he'd been nursing for years just coming into colour. I found him when I went out to call him for lunch. I won't describe that in detail because that grief is private, and also because it isn't the point of what I'm telling you. The point is the aftermath. The long rearranging of a life that had been organised around 2 people and now had to accommodate 1. The silence in the evenings, the single cup of tea, the way the cottage, which I had always loved, began to feel in certain lights like a place I was maintaining rather than inhabiting. My daughter Stacey lives in Bristol with her husband and their 2 children. My son Rodri is in Edinburgh. They rang regularly and visited when they could, and worried about me in the way that adult children worry about a widowed parent. Sincerely, but at a distance. Reassured too easily when I said I was fine. I was fine mostly. I had friends in the village and in Abereron. I walked the coastal path 3 mornings a week, regardless of weather. I kept a garden that Gerald would have approved of and read more than I ever had when life had been fuller. I managed. But managing and flourishing are different things, and I was under no illusion about which one I was doing. The laptop was Stacey's idea. She set it up during a visit in the autumn after Gerald died, walked me through the basics, installed things she said I'd find useful, and left me with a printed sheet of instructions I consulted for months. I was not a natural with it. I'd used computers at the primary school, where I'd taught for 30 years, but that was different, purposeful, bounded, nothing like the open endlessness of the internet approached without a specific task in mind. I used it cautiously at first. News, recipes, video calls with the grandchildren on Sunday evenings that became one of the fixed points of my week. Somewhere in the second year, I found a forum for people who'd been bereaved later in life. I stumbled onto it via an article I'd been reading, and I lurked for weeks before I posted anything, reading other people's accounts of loss with the particular relief of recognizing your own experience in someone else's words. When I did post, it was tentatively. A few sentences about Gerald, about the garden, about the way certain times of day were harder than others. The responses were kind, genuinely kind, in the way that strangers sometimes manage more readily than people who know you and are frightened by the proximity of your grief. I became a regular. I found people I looked forward to hearing from, whose situations I'd followed over months and whose small recoveries felt like shared victories. It was a measured and appropriate thing, that forum. It gave me something to look forward to in the evenings. It was good for me. I want to say that clearly, because what happened later has a way of casting everything before it in a suspicious light, and the forum was not suspicious. The forum was just a group of older people being honest about loss. That was where I first encountered the person who called himself David. He had been on the forum for a few months before he wrote to me directly. He was, according to his profile, 64, widowed 2 years previously, living in Shropshire, retired from a career in civil engineering. He had a way of writing that was measured and thoughtful, never performatively emotional, which I appreciated. Some people on the forum used it almost competitively, each post an escalation of suffering, and David was not like that. He was restrained, interested in others. He'd replied to several of my posts with observations that suggested he'd actually read what I'd written, rather than simply waiting for a space to respond. When he wrote to me privately, it was to share a piece by a Welsh poet he thought I might appreciate, given something I'd mentioned about walking the coastal path. He was right that I'd appreciate it. I did. I said so, and we began corresponding separately from the forum, through the messaging system it provided, and it was pleasant in a way I hadn't expected. A genuine exchange of ideas between two people at similar stages of life with overlapping sensibilities. We talked about books and about landscape and about the strange mathematics of grief, the way certain days ambushed you and others were unexpectedly bearable. Gerald would have liked the way the garden looks in October. The roses are finished, but the sedums have gone that deep bronze color he always loved. And the light in the afternoons falls across the back wall in a way that has not changed in 31 years. And sometimes I stand at the kitchen window, and the ordinary beauty of it is so acute I have to look away. I stood at that window on the morning I first felt properly uneasy about David. I couldn't have told you exactly why. It was the accumulation of small things, in the way that these recognitions usually are. By January, We had been corresponding for about 4 months. He had, at some point in November, suggested moving our conversations to a different platform, a messaging application I hadn't used before, which he explained allowed longer messages and was easier to navigate than the forum system. I downloaded it with Stacey's help during a phone call in which I mentioned I'd been chatting with someone from the forum and in which she said that was lovely, Mum, in the tone of someone who is reassured and not paying quite enough attention. The new platform was easier, as he'd said. The conversations became more frequent, sometimes daily. David was good company. He was funny in a dry, understated way, and he was curious about my life in a manner that felt like interest rather than interrogation. He asked about the coastal path and about Abereron and about the grandchildren and about what Gerald had been like, and I found myself describing Gerald in more detail than I had to anyone since the funeral, and it felt good to do that, to put him into words for someone who hadn't known him. The first thing that pulled at me slightly was in December. David mentioned a health difficulty. Nothing serious, he said. A recurring problem with his back that had been keeping him at home more than usual, limiting his walking. He described it in passing, and I expressed sympathy, and the conversation moved on. But a week later, when I mentioned something about the walks I'd been taking, he made a reference to his back that contradicted a detail he'd given me the previous week. Small enough that I almost didn't catch it. Small enough that I'd written it off as misremembering, as the natural imprecision of ordinary conversation, before I was even consciously aware I'd noticed it. I noticed it. The photograph above the fireplace, Gerald squinting. The blue that seems too vivid. That same summer we ate crab on the harbour at Abereron, and Gerald got sunburned across his nose and was absurdly pleased about it, said it made him look like a sailor. I have been thinking about that holiday a great deal in the past year, about how entirely uncomplicated it was, about the version of myself in that photograph, who had no idea how much weight the future was preparing to hand her. In January, he asked for my phone number. He framed it naturally, in the context of a conversation about a film we'd both mentioned wanting to watch, suggesting we might enjoy discussing it afterwards if we could speak directly rather than type. It was a reasonable request, and I had no concrete reason to refuse it, and I sat with my hands over the keyboard for longer than I should have before I typed a response. I didn't give him my number. I said I preferred to keep things written for now, that I found it easier, which was true as far as it went. He accepted it without apparent difficulty, said of course he understood completely, and we moved on. But the question had shifted something, and in the days after I found myself looking back over our conversations with a different quality of attention, what I noticed, working backwards through the months, was a pattern of accumulation I hadn't seen while I was inside it. He knew, by January, a very complete picture of my life. He knew the layout of my cottage, described across multiple conversations. He knew my routine, the morning walks, the village shop on Thursdays, the Sunday video calls with the grandchildren. He knew the names of my children and where they lived, and roughly when they visited. He knew I lived alone. He knew the nearest town and could, if he'd wanted to, have identified the cottage from the details I'd given about its position above the estuary. He had never, I realized, told me anything of comparable specificity about himself. I'd asked over the months, and he'd answered, but the answers had always been slightly general, slightly unverifiable. A town in Shropshire, a career in an industry I knew nothing about, a house he described only in the vaguest terms. He'd given me enough to feel like reciprocity without giving me anything I could confirm or locate. I thought about the detail that had contradicted itself in December. I thought about the slight precision with which he had catalogued my life while keeping his own behind gauze. I told Stacy. I rang her on a Tuesday evening, and I told her all of it, and I heard the quality of her silence as she listened. Stacy's husband worked in financial services and had a colleague with a background in online fraud investigation. And through that connection, which moved quickly once Stacy understood what I was describing, someone looked at what they could find about the account David had been using on the forum. The account was 14 months old. It had no online presence before the forum. The email address connected to it resolved to an account created a week before the forum registration. The profile photograph: a pleasant-faced man in his 60s in a garden setting, the kind of unremarkable image that registers as genuine precisely because it is so unremarkable, was a stock photograph available through an image library. Not a real person, not anyone's actual face. The investigator found something else, working through a connection I don't fully understand and won't try to explain. The messaging application David had asked me to download, the one that was easier than the forum system that allowed longer messages, had been used from an account linked by an IP address to a cluster of similar accounts, all created within a short window of time, all used to contact women over 60 living alone. Not in Wales specifically, across the UK. Some of the accounts had been active for over 2 years. There was a thread on a part of the internet that required specific access to reach, in which those accounts were discussed. A community organized around the targeted approach and manipulation of elderly women living alone, sharing methods, recording successes, exchanging the personal details they had extracted, discussing the most effective pace of escalation, the most productive questions, the tells that indicated a target was becoming isolated enough to approach more directly. My name was in one of the threads. My address was in one of the threads. Not just the village, the cottage, the position above the estuary. A description of the exterior accurate enough that I understood with cold certainty that someone had looked at it. Not from the road, but from the estuary path below, which is a public path, which anyone could walk. The thread was dated 3 weeks before David had asked for my phone number. The discussion in it concerned the optimal timing for a physical approach given what had been established about my routine. The Thursday shop, the morning walks, the Sunday calls. My routine, mapped and shared among strangers, on a thread I would never have found without help, for a purpose that the investigator described to me in careful and measured language, while Stacy held my hand across the kitchen table. The police were involved, a specialist unit that dealt with online exploitation of older adults, which exists because this is not rare, because there are communities built around this specific category of harm, because the patience and the methodology and the long careful accumulation of a vulnerable person's trust is something that has been refined and shared and improved upon in corners of the internet where no ordinary search would find it. The account that called itself David was linked to an individual who was eventually identified and prosecuted. I was not the only woman. I was not the most recent. The thread that contained my address contained 6 other addresses, and the conversations recorded in the same cluster of accounts showed the same structure repeated across different women, different counties, different names and routines and layouts of home. The same patience, the same questions, the same gradual accumulation of everything needed to locate and approach someone who had been made through months of careful cultivation to feel less alone. I did not go to court. I was not required to. I was kept informed at each stage by a liaison officer who was thorough and kind and who told me at the conclusion of the case, that my call to Stacy had likely prevented something that she could not specify in legal terms, but which the pattern of the other cases made sufficiently clear. I keep that photograph on the mantelpiece because I refuse to let what happened take anything further from me than it already has. What it has taken is harder to name than a photograph. It is the ease I used to have with strangers, the open quality of my attention when someone shows interest, the willingness to describe where I live and how I live without a layer of calculation underneath. I had not, at 67, expected to have to learn those things. I had thought that the worst the world could do to me had already been done, in a garden in May, beside roses that were just coming into colour. I was wrong about that. There is always, it turns out, another thing to lose and another kind of person willing to take it. I walk the coastal path 3 mornings a week. I tend the garden. I see the grandchildren on Sundays, and I love those calls with a fierceness that would probably embarrass me if I said it aloud. I am still on the bereavement forum, because the forum did not do anything wrong, and the people on it are genuine, and the kindness I found there was real, even if one of the presences I took for real was not. I am more careful now, more deliberate about what I say and to whom, and how much I allow the picture to be assembled. I check, now, in ways I did not check before, whether what a person is giving me matches what I am giving them. It is a poorer way to move through the world, that vigilance. It costs something every day. The photograph is still on the mantelpiece. Gerald, squinting. Me, laughing at something that is lost now, something private, something from before. The blue behind us that seems too vivid to be real. It was real. That's the thing I hold on to. That particular blue, that particular day, that particular version of myself with no idea what was coming. All of it was real, and it happened, and nobody can reach back and take it away. Some things, it turns out, they cannot touch. I wasn't looking for anything specific that night. I couldn't sleep, and I'd already burned through the usual distractions, Netflix, Reddit, old messages I shouldn't have reread. That kind of night. You're not tired, just restless. Everything's quiet, but your head won't shut up. I ended up back on the dark web. I'd messed around with it before, mostly out of curiosity. Never bought anything, never went deep. But that night, I felt pulled toward it, like I was itching for something I couldn't name. They always say you should stop scrolling when your hands start to shake, or when you feel the temperature change in the room, or when the silence becomes too loud. It's one of those internet urban legends people share to scare each other off the deep end of the web. I used to think that was all drama, just horror fanfare for people who wanted to feel edgy. Now I think those warnings exist for a reason. It started with insomnia, that kind of mindless, late-night restlessness where nothing feels real and the smallest click can lead to hours vanishing. I was going through a rough patch, jobless, between apartments, staying in my older brother's spare room and trying to keep out of the way. My days had no structure, and my nights were filled with screen glow and silence. I had gone through every surface web rabbit hole I could find, creepy forums, niche subreddits, amateur surveillance camera archives. At some point, I started getting bored with the usual stuff. It didn't hit the same. I wasn't looking for horror exactly. I just wanted to feel something. Anything. That's when I remembered the dark web. I'd heard all the stories, fake red rooms, black market hoaxes, the usual dramatic stuff. But I also knew the tech. I knew how to navigate it safely. Or at least, I thought I did. I spun up Tails OS on an old laptop, routed through Tor, and kept my identity clean. For a while, it was just curiosity. Old message boards, empty markets, strange listings with broken links. It was like walking through an abandoned shopping mall, but with the lingering smell of something rotting just out of sight. But one thread kept coming back. It was buried inside a defunct forum with barely any traffic, mostly dead links and gibberish posts. But one thread, titled simply "Windowless," had recent activity. A few users kept responding to each other in single words, like coded check-ins. I didn't understand what they were saying, but something about how quiet the rest of the forum was made that thread feel alive, like it was pulsing just under the surface. I watched it for days before someone posted something new. They dropped a link, no fanfare, just a bare hyperlink with a timestamp and the words "real feed." It led to a login screen. I didn't have credentials, obviously, but I took a screenshot out of habit. A few minutes later, a second post appeared with a new link. This one had a different domain. I clicked it without really thinking. It brought me to a countdown. 1 minute 44 seconds. There was no text, no branding, just the timer and a black video window below it. I stared at it, trying to guess what it might be. The chat was open, but it was locked. I couldn't post, only watch. The numbers ticked down. I almost closed the tab, but something made me wait. Maybe it was the way the screen made everything around me feel darker. Or maybe I was just curious in a way I didn't want to admit. The hum of the air conditioning sounded distant, like I was sinking below something. When the timer hit 0, the feed activated. The screen lit up with a dim, grainy video of a room. Small, concrete, a single metal chair bolted to the floor, a chain on the back wall. Nothing else. At first it was empty. I thought maybe it was a hoax, another ARG, something theatrical. But then a figure stepped into frame. Not the person I expected. It was a man in dark clothes, face obscured. He looked into the camera briefly, then left the frame. A few seconds later, he returned, dragging someone. The person's face was hidden, but they were conscious, struggling weakly, hands tied. They were shoved into the chair and strapped in. The chat exploded. Lines of text flew by. Most of it was incomprehensible. Users bidding, commenting, laughing. Some posted emojis. Others just spammed numbers. There was a list forming on the right. Usernames next to dollar amounts. And at the top of the list was a name I recognized. Mine. It didn't make sense. I hadn't logged in. I hadn't made an account. But there it was. My username from an old game account I hadn't used in years, spelled exactly the same. And next to it, a bid, £8,300. I felt something drop in my chest. My hands were sweating. I reached for the mouse, but it lagged. The screen flickered. The video kept going. The person in the chair looked up. Even with the resolution as bad as it was, I could see the fear in their face. They were crying, muffled. Their eyes scanned the room like they were looking for a way out, and for some awful reason, I felt like they could see me. Like I wasn't just watching, like I was part of it. The camera zoomed in slightly. More bids came in. More usernames I didn't recognize, but mine stayed near the top. Then the figure came back, holding something. A blunt object. The way he moved was calm, mechanical. And just before the feed cut out, he looked directly at the camera. The screen went black. The chat froze. Then the browser closed itself. I sat there staring at my desktop, heart racing. I hadn't done anything. I hadn't clicked anything except the link. How did it know my name? That night, I didn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that man's face, or what little I could see of it, staring through the screen. Not like he was performing, like he was watching me. The next day, I got an email. No subject line. Just an image. A photo of my house, taken from the street. It wasn't recent. It had to be at least a year old, before I moved. But it was mine. You could see my old car in the driveway. The busted mailbox I never fixed. More messages came after that, each one from a different address. Most just contained links. I didn't click them. One had a video attachment. I deleted it without opening it. Even hovering over it made my skin crawl. Then my phone rang. Unknown number. I let it go to voicemail. The message was 10 seconds of silence, followed by the sound of something metal scraping across concrete. I left the house that night. I didn't pack a bag. I just walked out, got in my car, and drove. Slept in a motel an hour away. Threw the laptop in a dumpster behind a gas station. Bought a new phone the next morning. But it didn't matter, because the next morning there was a piece of paper tucked under the motel door. Just one sentence. Your bid was accepted. I don't know how they found me. Maybe they never lost me. I moved across the country after that. Changed my name. Got a job under the table. No credit cards. No internet in my name. I even stopped using public Wi-Fi. I did everything you're supposed to do when you want to disappear. And for a while, I thought I'd done it. It worked. For almost a year. Until last week. I found a box outside my door. No postage, no return address. Just sitting there like someone had placed it and walked away. Inside was a single item. A webcam. Old, dusty, with a cracked lens. The kind you'd plug into a desktop tower back in 2005. I hadn't seen one like it in years. Underneath it, there was a folded note. Smile for the feed. I haven't turned on a screen since, and I don't think I ever will again. Or with the practical facts in the order they happened. But I always end up back at the browser. Tab still open, screen still lit, her mug on the desk beside the keyboard with the tea still warm. And I remember thinking, in that first stupid second, that she must have just stepped out. She hadn't stepped out. Okay, I'll try to do this properly. Her name was Priya. She was 22. We were on the same English literature course at university. Second year when we met. Third year when everything happened. She was from Coventry originally. Her family still there. And she had that thing some people from the Midlands have where the warmth is completely real, but also completely undemonstrative, like it's just a baseline rather than an effort. She didn't perform friendliness. She was just friendly without making anything of it. We met at a seminar on early 20th century fiction that neither of us wanted to attend. Sat next to each other by chance, ended up walking to the library afterwards. Ended up in the cafe attached to the library because neither of us actually needed anything from the library. Talked for 2 hours. I walked back to my flat that afternoon thinking I'd made a friend, which doesn't happen that often when you're 20 and new somewhere and not entirely sure how to be around people you don't yet know. She was the best reader I've ever met. That's a strange thing to say about someone maybe. But if you do English literature, you know what I mean. Some people read books and some people read books. Priya read them like they were evidence of something. Like she was trying to work out what the author was concealing by looking at what they'd chosen to say. She told me once that she'd wanted to be a barrister before she ended up on the literature course. And you could feel that in how she approached everything. This assumption that the surface wasn't the whole story, that understanding something meant getting underneath it. She was funny, quietly funny, the kind that sneaks up on you. She made observations about people and situations that were accurate in an almost uncomfortable way, and she delivered them with a completely straight face. And then she'd give you this look when you laughed as if she was mildly surprised you'd caught it. I loved her, not romantically. I want to be clear about that. Not because it matters to the story, but because I'm aware that bereaved friend narratives get assumed into romance, and this wasn't that. It was the kind of friendship that in different circumstances might have lasted 40 years. The kind where the other person becomes part of how you think, where you find yourself formulating observations you want to share with them before you've realized you're doing it. Present tense, that last bit. I'm aware. I'm going to describe what I found because I've been told, by the counselor I've been seeing, that describing things is part of the process. I'm not sure I believe that, actually. I think describing things is sometimes just describing things, but I'll do it anyway. I had a key to her flat because we'd been swapping keys since second year, just in case. Lost keys, locked out situations, the practical logistics of being close to someone in a city where you don't have family nearby. I used the key on a Tuesday afternoon in March because she'd missed a seminar that morning, which she never did, and wasn't answering her phone. I knocked first, obviously. Then I used the key. The flat was a one-bedroom on the third floor of a converted house about 15 minutes from campus. It always smelled of the particular candle she burned when she was working. Something with cedar in it, I never knew the name. It smelled of that when I came in. Music was playing from somewhere, low, from her laptop, speakers probably. The kind of ambient music she put on when she was reading, not music with words. The bedroom door was open. There are things I'm not going to describe. I mean that, not as coyness or evasion, but as a genuine statement about capacity. There are images from that afternoon that I have described once to the police, in a room with recording equipment and a woman who was professionally equipped to receive that kind of description. And I said what needed to be said, and I haven't said it since, and I'm not going to say it here. What I will say is that what had been done to Priya had taken time, deliberate time, that what I saw was the result of something sustained and methodical, something that had not been quick, and that the evidence of that was not possible to misread. I rang 999. I went into the hallway, and I sat on the floor with my back against the wall, and I waited. While I waited, I looked at her browser. The laptop was on the desk in the corner, still lit, still running. The tab that was open was not something I could look away from immediately, even though looking at it was the wrong instinct. My brain was trying to understand what had happened, and it went toward information rather than away from it. That's how I found out what I found out. I should say that what follows took me months to piece together. The evening of... I wasn't in a state to understand anything. I was in shock, which sounds like a cliche and is apparently a real and specific neurological state that I have since read about, because understanding things is how I cope with them, or how I try to. Shock involves a narrowing of cognitive function and a disruption to the consolidation of new memories, and that describes that Tuesday fairly accurately. What I know from the police investigation, from conversations with detectives over the following months, from what I was eventually shown and told, and from my own memory of the browser screen that I've returned to and examined and re-examined until I'm fairly confident I know what was on it. What was on it was a stream, not a recording, a live stream, or what had been a live stream. It had ended. The interface was still open, a dark-bordered player on a dark background site, the kind of layout that doesn't want to be found by ordinary means. The stream had ended according to the timestamp, approximately 40 minutes before I arrived. The player was static, but the tab was still open, the way tabs stay open when no one closes them, the way things stay exactly where they were when someone last touched them. Priya had not been watching the stream. She had been in it. I need to stop here for a second. I'm aware that the previous sentence is just sitting there. I wrote it, and then I stopped writing for a while and did other things. Made tea, looked out the window at the street, checked my phone for something to look at. That wasn't this. I do that a lot. My attention goes sideways when I get close to the center of it. The counselor says that's normal. The counselor says a lot of things are normal that don't feel normal, which I suppose is the point. What I was going to say, before I went sideways, is that the reconstruction of what happened, how it happened, how she ended up in that stream, who was responsible, that reconstruction took a long time and is still, in some parts, incomplete. What the police established was this. The site on her browser was a platform operating in a part of the internet that required specific access to reach. It hosted live streams of real harm. The streams were ticketed, access paid for in advance, participants receiving a link at a specified time. The streams were advertised in advance on associated forums with descriptions of the content and the subject. Multiple people had watched what happened to Priya in real time. The viewing figures were in the investigation file. I was told the number once and I won't repeat it. It's a number that has changed how I think about most things, how Priya came to be connected to this, whether she had stumbled onto it, whether someone she knew had connections to it, whether she had been identified and targeted through her online activity, is something the investigation addressed without fully resolving. There was evidence she had been in contact in the weeks before with someone she believed to be a fellow literature student at another university. The contact had been through an academic forum, reasonable and plausible, the kind of connection students make all the time. The person she'd been in contact with was not a literature student. Beyond that, I have been told to wait for conclusions that keep not arriving. I keep thinking about the barrister's thing. What she'd said about wanting to be a barrister. The way she read everything as evidence of something being concealed. She was better at getting underneath surfaces than almost anyone I've known, and she still didn't see it. That's not fair. That's me being angry in the wrong direction. She was 22 and trusting, and had no reason to apply that analytical attention to someone who presented as a peer, a fellow reader, a person who was interested in the same thing she was. The cruelty of it is precisely that what was used against her was the genuine, specific, particular person she was, her intelligence, her interests, her assumption that someone engaging seriously with literature was probably trustworthy. They found a way in through who she actually was. There's a seminar I attended last term, month or so after everything. I don't know why I went. Inertia, maybe. Or the alternative was sitting in my flat. It was on Victorian sensation fiction, the kind of novels built around concealed secrets, around what is hidden in plain sight, around the gap between surfaces and what's underneath. Priya would have loved it. She would have had things to say that made everyone else reconsider what they'd read. I sat in the back and listened and said nothing and looked at the chair she would have sat in and thought about absolutely nothing for most of an hour, which is the closest to peace I've found since March. I'm still on the course. People ask if I'm okay and I say yes, more or less, which is approximately true on the days when it is, and a necessary fiction on the days when it isn't. I function. I hand things in. The work is harder than it was, because I can't read anything now without hearing her voice reading it alongside me. And sometimes that's unbearable, and sometimes it's the only thing that makes the work feel like it matters. Her family are in Coventry. Her mum rang me once, a few months after. We talked for a long time. I can't write about that conversation. Some things are not mine to share, and that's one of them. I'll just say that her mum sounded like her. The same quality in the voice, the same warmth that didn't perform itself, and that I understood from that conversation where Priya had learned to be the person she was, and that the loss expanded in that conversation to a size I hadn't fully understood it was. The investigation is ongoing. I'm told this regularly. I believe it in the sense that I have no reason not to, and I question it in the sense that ongoing investigations are a long way from concluded ones, and I try not to think too much about the gap between what the police can do and what the site is probably continuing to do, because that gap is very large and thinking about it doesn't close it. The cedar candle smell. I noticed it when I came in that afternoon, and I've never been able to separate it from what I found, and I haven't been able to be in a room where that scent is burning since. I know that's the brain doing what the brain does, associating things that happen together, protecting you from re-exposure. I know it's neurologically explicable. It doesn't help much, but it's something to hold on to. That there are explanations for the stranger parts of how this has landed in me. That I'm not just randomly falling apart, that the falling apart has a shape. The browser, still open, the tea still warm. I think about the 40 minutes, between the stream ending and me arriving, what those 40 minutes were, who was doing what in them, whether she was already gone or whether she was. I stop there. I stop there every time. I don't have enough information to complete that thought accurately, and I've learned slowly that completing it inaccurately doesn't serve anything. She was 22. She wanted to be a barrister. She read books like they were evidence of something concealed. She was right about that. She was right about almost everything. I just wish she'd been wrong about people. I still get that moment. Sometimes when I'm halfway through a normal day, or scrolling through something stupid like memes, and I'll feel it all over again. That pause, that breath I forgot to take when I realized who I was looking at on that screen. It was my brother. Let me back up. This happened about 5 years ago. I was 22, working part-time and drifting a bit. I spent way too much time online, if I'm being honest, especially late at night when the house was dead quiet and I couldn't sleep. There's something weird about that hour between midnight and 4 a.m., where your brain convinces you that clicking on anything is fine, like you're not accountable at that time. That's how I ended up on the dark web. I wasn't into anything sketchy. I wasn't trying to buy anything illegal or hire a hitman or whatever people think happens there. For me, it was just about curiosity, exploration. I liked peeling back layers of the internet, seeing what existed underneath the surface. I followed all the usual safety advice, VPNs, Tails OS, burner laptops. It wasn't about being edgy. I genuinely just liked the sense that I was in a space where the rules didn't fully apply. At first, it was the usual. Forums, strange market pages, broken storefronts that had obviously been dead for years. Occasionally, I'd come across these obscure blogs, like digital journals of people who clearly weren't right. Some of them were rambling messes. Others were scarily lucid. Those were the worst. One night, I found a link in the comments of a dead thread. It was just a string of text, no preview, no context. But the message above it just said, "For those who want to see what they paid for." It It led to a blank page with a single embedded player. No chat box, no menu. Just the word live in red text above the video window. The loading bar took a while to move, and I remember that because I nearly clicked away out of boredom. But then the stream started. It was dark at first, bad lighting. I could barely make anything out. Just a person, slumped forward, hands bound, shirtless, face obscured by their hair and the grainy quality of the feed. And I remember thinking, this has to be fake. Like, who's going to live stream a crime? That's ridiculous. It has to be performance art or a prank site. I kept looking for the watermark or the subscription prompt. Something to tell me it was just theatre. But then he looked up. Just for a second. That's when my stomach dropped. Because even though the quality was awful, I knew that face. It was Jamie, my brother. I hadn't seen him in months. He'd taken a gap year to go travelling after college. Southeast Asia mostly. Last I heard he was somewhere in Cambodia. He'd post on Instagram now and then, but nothing recent. I didn't think much of it. I figured Wi-Fi was spotty, that he was just being present or whatever. But there he was, on my screen, bruised, silent, and alive. I froze. I didn't know what to do. I just sat there with my hand on the mouse, breathing like I'd just sprinted somewhere. The stream didn't show anything violent, not at first. It was just him, alone in that room. And the longer I watched, the more certain I became that this wasn't staged. The lighting wasn't cinematic. The set wasn't designed. It was just real. I remember I started whispering to myself, like saying things out loud would make it stop. I kept repeating his name under my breath, like he might somehow hear it through the screen. Then a figure entered the frame. No face, just boots and gloves. They walked into shot slowly, and Jamie flinched. He didn't scream or cry. He just recoiled, like someone who'd already been through this more than once. That's when I snapped out of it. I yanked the Ethernet cable, shut the laptop, nearly dropped it. My hands were shaking so bad I almost couldn't unlock my phone. I called my parents first. It was 3 a.m, but they picked up on the first ring. I couldn't explain anything clearly. I think I just kept saying, I saw him, over and over. They contacted the embassy, filed reports, reached out to his travel contacts. Everything went into overdrive. And the weirdest part? They found him. Not the same day, but close. He was discovered in a warehouse near the edge of Phnom Penh, drugged, dehydrated, but alive. He had no idea how long he'd been there. The last thing he remembered was getting into a tuk-tuk after a night out. Everything after that was a blur, just flashes of light, muffled voices, and cold concrete. He didn't know about the stream. He still doesn't, actually. I never told him. I told everyone else I found a tip online, that someone had posted about a man matching his description being held in a warehouse. It wasn't even a lie, really. Just not the whole truth. After he came home, things went back to normal, on the surface. He doesn't talk about it, and we all pretend that's fine. But sometimes I catch him staring off when he thinks no one's watching. Like he's still there, stuck in that room, waiting for something to happen again. And I get it, because I still see him too. Not the version we have now, but the one on that screen. Silent, tied, waiting. That was the last time I ever touched the dark web. I wiped everything, scrubbed the drives, burned the laptop, if you can believe that. Literally threw it in a fire pit. I don't know who ran that site, or how they found him, or how I ended up there at the exact right time. Maybe it wasn't coincidence. Maybe someone wanted me to see it. Either way, I got out. He got out. But I still don't let myself think about how many other people clicked that same link. and didn't recognize the face. "4 minutes. That's how long I watched it before I closed the laptop. I've been sitting with that fact for over a year now, and I still don't know exactly what it says about me, but I know it doesn't say anything good. I'm going to try and explain how I ended up there. Not to excuse it, just because the how matters, I think. It matters because the way it happens is never the way you'd imagine it happening. You don't make a single, obvious wrong decision. You make 100 small, almost invisible ones, and then you're somewhere you can't entirely explain. We'd had a break-in. That's where it started. Not at our house, at a neighbor's 3 doors down. A couple in their 60s, semi-retired. Someone had come through their back gate on a Wednesday afternoon while they were both out. Took a laptop, some cash from a kitchen drawer, a small jewelry box from the bedroom. The sort of burglary the police take a statement about and then don't pursue, because they know exactly where the odds sit, and so do you. Our neighbor, the husband, he told me about it over the fence one Sunday, and I could hear in the way he described it that the thing that had really shaken him wasn't the stuff that was taken. It was the idea of someone moving through his kitchen, opening his drawers, standing in his bedroom. He kept coming back to that detail. The bedroom. I went home that afternoon and started looking at home security cameras. Straightforward enough. I wanted something that covered the back of our house and the alley that ran behind the terrace. My wife thought I was overreacting. Maybe I was. But I went down that particular rabbit hole with some thoroughness over the following couple of weeks. Comparison sites, review forums, YouTube walkthroughs of different systems. And somewhere in that process, as tends to happen when you spend long enough looking for something specific on the internet, I started encountering other things, adjacent things, forums where people discuss security more broadly, what the police could and couldn't do with residential footage, how footage got retrieved after incidents, what investigators actually looked for, and somewhere in that chain, I genuinely couldn't retrace the exact steps now. I ended up reading about private investigation marketplaces. Not anything sinister at first. Legitimate seeming services. People offering to trace addresses, verify identities, that kind of thing. Some of it clearly legal, some of it in a grayer area. And from there, because curiosity doesn't stop when it should, I started looking at where those services crossed over into places the regular internet didn't host. That's how I ended up on the dark web for the first time. 43 years old, secondary school geography teacher, semi-detached in Nottingham. Not someone who'd have described himself as the type. I want to be careful here about not making it sound more purposeful than it was. I wasn't looking for anything specific. I had no agenda. I was just, and I know this sounds inadequate, interested in how far down it went, what the actual geography of it was. I'd read the same articles everyone reads, and I wanted to see it for myself. The way you might read about a place and feel a vague compulsion to go there, even knowing there's nothing there for you. The first few sessions were unremarkable, bleak in places, disturbing in patches, but not the visceral horror that journalism tends to imply. A lot of it was dreary. A lot of it was clearly either fake or performative. People trying to seem more dangerous than they were. I browsed cautiously, touched nothing, gave nothing away. I was, as I'd been telling myself almost constantly, just looking. The camera forums were what pulled me back. And I say forums loosely. They weren't discussion boards exactly. They were more like listing hubs. People offering access to feeds, selling footage, that sort of thing. I'd stumbled onto one while following a link about security system vulnerabilities, which had felt, at the time, directly relevant to what I'd originally been researching. See how that works. See how clean the justification feels right up until it doesn't. Most of the feeds being offered were either clearly fabricated or so degraded in quality they were barely watchable. Some were security camera angles that looked genuinely unmodified. Car parks, stairwells, the corners of warehouses, and carried a different kind of unease. Not because of what they showed, but because somewhere someone had gained access to a camera they had no right to and was selling that access like a commodity. I found that disturbing in a way I couldn't entirely look away from, the way you slow down passing an accident. I went back 4 or 5 times over a couple of weeks. I want to be precise about how that progression felt, because it wasn't uniform. The first return was almost academic. I told myself I was going back to understand the structure of the site better, to confirm what I'd seen was what I thought it was. The second time, I stayed longer than the first and felt worse leaving. By the third or fourth visit, something had shifted, and I was no longer pretending I was there for any reason other than the one I didn't want to name. Each time I closed the laptop, I sat with a residue that took longer to clear. That's the mechanism of it. You don't stay because you want to. You stay because leaving feels like an active decision, and staying just feels like not having left yet. And each time you go back, the threshold for going back has already been lowered by the fact that you went back before. The listing I found on the 5th or 6th visit looked, at first, like others I'd seen. It was titled simply, something like Residential East Midlands, Ongoing, and the thumbnail was low resolution and dark. A room. Interior. I assumed it was another case of someone selling access to a poorly secured home camera, the kind of thing you could apparently set up accidentally with a cheap off-brand system and the wrong default settings. I clicked through, and what I saw wasn't an accidental feed. The image was clear, much clearer than most. A living room, ordinary in every detail, sofa, television, a low bookshelf, the corner of a dining table, natural light coming from the left side, meaning a window just off frame. The angle was from high up, which told you the camera was either mounted near the ceiling or placed on a high shelf, and it was fixed and stable in a way that a phone prop somewhere wouldn't be. Someone had installed a camera in this room deliberately, and they had done it with enough care that it wasn't visible in the frame. There was no timestamp, but the daylight suggested daytime, and the room was occupied. A woman was sitting on the sofa. She had her back partly to the camera, angled towards the television, and she had her legs drawn up beneath her in the way people sit when they're comfortable and not expecting to be looked at. She was wearing a grey jumper, sleeves pushed up to the elbows. She was reading something, a phone or possibly a small tablet, and the quality of the image was good enough that I could see her moving her thumb up the screen occasionally. At one point, she tilted her head slightly, the way you do when something you've read catches you, and then went still again. She had no idea she was being filmed. There was nothing in her posture, nothing in the unhurried way she sat, that suggested anything other than a person alone in their own home on an ordinary afternoon, existing in the private way people do when they believe no one is watching. At some point during those 4 minutes, a mug on the coffee table in front of her sent up a thin curl of steam. That's the image I come back to more than any other. Not her face. I never saw that clearly. Just the steam rising from the mug, steady and completely ordinary, while somewhere on the other side of a dark web listing a stranger sat and watched. I've tried to reconstruct exactly what was passing through my mind in those 4 minutes, And the honest answer is not enough. There's a delay between seeing something and understanding what it is you're actually looking at. And in that delay, I just watched, the way you might watch anything on a screen, because screens have a way of making everything feel like content. It took an embarrassingly long time for the full weight of it to land, that this was someone's home, that she had no idea, that by not closing the laptop, I was participating in something that had been done to her without her knowledge or consent. By the time I finally did close it, my hands were unsteady and I felt something in my chest that wasn't quite nausea, but was close enough to matter. I closed the laptop and went and stood in the kitchen for a while. My wife was upstairs. I could hear her moving around. I stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the back garden and tried to think through what I'd just seen with some degree of clarity. The camera in that room hadn't got there by accident. Someone had entered that house or had access to it, had some reason to be there, and had installed a device, concealed it, and then set up a way to broadcast or record the feed. Then they'd listed it, priced it, offered it to whoever found their way to that particular corner of the dark web and had the inclination to pay. I didn't know how many people had viewed it. I didn't know how long the listing had been up. I didn't know where in the East Midlands it was, or whether the East Midlands description was even accurate. I also didn't know who the woman was, but I could see her clearly enough to describe her. And I kept thinking, uselessly, circularly, about the fact that at some point she'd get up from that sofa and make a cup of tea, or go upstairs, or do any of the things people do in the privacy of their own homes, and the camera would be there for all of it. The question of what to do sat with me for days, in a way that was genuinely immobilizing. I'd have to explain where I'd seen it. I'd have to explain what I'd been doing on the dark web and why. And I'd have to do that to a police officer. And the version of events I'd tell would include the 4 minutes. Because leaving that out felt like the kind of a mission that compounds everything. My wife didn't know I'd been going on there. Nobody did. I waited longer than I should have. About 2 weeks. I kept half convincing myself that the listing would have been taken down, that someone else would have reported it, that the problem would resolve itself in the way that problems sometimes do when you're too cowardly to resolve them yourself. None of that happened, as far as I knew. What did happen was that I went back once, just once, to check whether the listing was still there. It was, and it had grown. There were now 3 thumbnails alongside the original living room. A bedroom, the same high-mounted angle, the same deliberate framing, a bed with the covers pulled back on one side, a wardrobe door left slightly open, a bathroom, the image darker, the camera positioned in a way that took me a moment to understand, and then made me close my eyes briefly when I did, and a 4th thumbnail I hadn't expected. The front of the house, exterior, taken from the street, just the facade. A parked car visible at the edge of the frame. The house number above the door, clear enough to read. That last one was what made the floor feel uncertain beneath me. The living room feed was violation enough, but the exterior shot, the house number, meant that whoever was running this listing wasn't just selling footage, they were selling location. They were offering anyone who paid enough not just access to her rooms, but the means to find the building those rooms were inside. I closed the laptop before I'd fully processed what I was looking at. I'd been on the page for perhaps 30 seconds, but I sat at the desk for a long time afterwards, and the feeling wasn't the dull, residual discomfort of the previous visits. It was sharper than that. It was the specific, nauseating understanding that whatever this was, it had escalated since I'd first found it, and I had spent 2 weeks doing nothing while it escalated. I went to the police the following morning. I walked into the station on Canal Street and told them I needed to report something. And when the officer asked me what it related to, I said it related to surveillance footage being distributed without someone's knowledge or consent. I'd rehearsed the phrase. It sounded cleaner than what it was. The process that followed was both more and less than I'd expected. A detective came to the house 2 days later, a man younger than me, who took notes on a laptop and asked specific questions without much expression. He wanted to know the exact URL, the structure of the listing, what I'd seen, how I'd found it. He asked, at one point, whether I'd had any direct contact with whoever posted the listing, and I said no, and he wrote that down without comment in a way that felt like its own kind of assessment. He wasn't rude. He was just thorough in a way that made everything feel documented. He told me at the end that they'd be treating it seriously, that this type of offense, covert recording distributed for commercial purposes, carried significant penalties if someone was identified and charged. He mentioned that locating the victim, if she hadn't already come forward independently, would be a priority. He didn't tell me anything about how they'd go about any of it, or what the realistic chances were, or what any of it would produce. He thanked me for coming forward. He let himself out. I've not heard anything since. That was over a year ago. I don't know whether they found her. I don't know whether, if they found her, she knew. Whether they'd had to tell her that there was a camera in her living room, her bedroom, her bathroom, and that footage from it had been offered for sale to strangers on the dark web. I think about what that conversation would feel like, being told that, the particular violation of it. Your own home, the one place that's supposed to be unconditionally yours, turned into something else without your knowledge. I also think about the person who installed those cameras, who they were in relation to her. You don't put a camera in someone's living room from a distance. You have to be inside the house to do it, which means the person who did this had been invited in, or had a key, or had let themselves in. A partner, an ex-partner, a landlord, a tradesman, someone she trusted enough to let through her front door. That's the detail I can't move past. Not the dark web listing, not the footage, not any of the specific things I saw. It's the fact that whoever did this had stood in that room, looked up at the ceiling or across at the high shelf or wherever the camera ended up, and decided where to put it, had thought about angles and coverage and what would and wouldn't be in frame, had done all of that while she was somewhere else in the house, or while she was out, or while they were supposed to be fixing the boiler or painting the skirting board or doing whatever it was she'd let them in to do. I unboxed our home security cameras about a month after all of this, and my wife asked why I'd gone off the idea. I said I'd read some things about data privacy and wasn't sure the particular brand stored footage securely. She accepted that. I've never told her the real reason. It's partly that the whole episode still embarrasses me. The dark web browsing, the 4 minutes, the 2 weeks I spent not doing anything. But it's also something more specific than embarrassment. It's that I now know what a camera in a room looks like from the inside of the footage. I know the angle. I know the quality. And every time I walk into my own living room, I find myself looking briefly at the high corners, the tops of shelves, the spaces just above the door frame. I've never found anything. Of course I haven't. There's no reason there would be anything. But the looking has become a reflex now, and I can't seem to stop it. And what I'm really checking for every time is whether someone has stood in my house and done to me what someone did to her. That's what I tell myself it is anyway. The habit of checking. The small involuntary question of whether someone has been here and decided where to put the camera while I was somewhere else. About 6 months after I reported it, I did one final search. Not for the listing itself, I wasn't going back there, just for any news coverage that might tell me whether someone had been charged, whether she'd been found, whether any of it had amounted to anything. I didn't find that. What I did find, on a thread in a corner of the ordinary internet where people discuss this kind of thing, was a post describing the listing in enough detail that I knew immediately it was the same one. The high-angle living room, the East Midlands location, the exterior shot with the house number. Someone had written it up in the flat, almost clinical way people use when they're trying to seem detached from something that has clearly unsettled them. The post was dated 4 months after I'd gone to the police. 4 months after I'd sat across a desk and given a detective the URL, the structure, everything I could remember. The listing had still been up. I've thought about what that means, whether the report went nowhere, whether the site moved faster than any investigation could, whether she's still living in that house without knowing. I don't have answers to any of it. I probably never will. What I have instead is the steam rising from the mug. That image, sitting in the place where a resolution should be. A woman alone in her living room on an ordinary afternoon, completely at ease, while somewhere out there, the number above her front door was available to anyone willing to pay for it. That's the part that doesn't leave, not what I saw, what she didn't know. I should probably start by saying that I didn't end up in this freezing bedsit by accident. I've been wearing 2 jumpers most evenings just to take the edge off the cold, sitting here in this cramped little room, while I tried to make sense of how things went the way they did. I had a proper flat in Norwich not long ago, decent heating, a bit of space, a view over the park. But I walked away from all of that once I realized what I'd actually been part of these past 8 months. Most nights now, I sit with my laptop balanced on my knees, not typing, just staring at the screen, as I think back over the messages I read and the content I reviewed, all the tiny decisions I made without really understanding who was watching. I used to tell people I worked in content moderation, the harmless kind that keeps things neat and polite. Then I lost that job when the company replaced half of us with automation, and I took on something else that paid far better for what sounded like the same sort of work. It wasn't. And that's the story I'm trying to tell here. How a job I thought I understood ended with me hiding out in a cold room, wondering if the people behind it are going to come looking. I'd been moderating content for a social media platform for about 4 years, before the company decided artificial intelligence could do most of what I did for a fraction of the cost. One day I was reviewing flagged posts and comments. The next I was being told my position was being eliminated, along with 60% of the moderation team. I was 39 years old with a very specific skill set that turned out to be increasingly obsolete. The redundancy package was adequate but not generous, and I spent the better part of 2 months applying for similar roles. Most companies were moving toward automation or outsourcing to countries where labor was cheaper. The few positions I found wanted people with technical qualifications I didn't possess. That's when I saw the job posting on a remote work website. Someone was looking for experienced content moderators to help manage discussion spaces on privacy-focused platforms. The pay was exceptional, nearly £3,000 per month for what they estimated would be about 30 hours of work per week. They emphasized that they needed people who could work independently, make consistent judgment calls, and maintain strict confidentiality about the platforms they'd be moderating. I should have questioned why anyone would pay such generous rates for content moderation work when most companies were desperately trying to reduce those costs. Should have wondered what kind of privacy-focused platforms needed human moderators rather than automated systems. But I was getting desperate. watching my savings diminish while I sent out application after application with no responses. The application process was straightforward. I submitted my CV along with examples of moderation decisions I'd made in my previous role, explaining my reasoning and approach to balancing free expression with community safety. Within 2 days, I had a response requesting a video interview. The interviewer called himself David, though I suspected that wasn't his real name. He explained that their platforms operated in spaces where mainstream social media companies had limited reach, serving communities that valued privacy and unrestricted discussion. They needed moderators who could maintain order without being overly restrictive. People who understood the difference between genuine safety concerns and content that was simply controversial or unpopular. He was careful to emphasize that the work would involve reviewing material that might be disturbing or offensive. The platforms attracted people with unconventional views, and moderators needed to have thick skin and good judgment about what actually constituted a rule violation versus what was just unpleasant but legal expression. That all sounded reasonable to me. I'd spent years reviewing flagged content on mainstream platforms and was accustomed to seeing unpleasant material. I understood that content moderation required balancing competing values, and I was confident in my ability to make consistent judgments based on clear guidelines. David offered me the position at the end of the interview, pending completion of a brief training period where I'd shadow experienced moderators and learn the specific rules and expectations for their platforms. The pay would start immediately, and I'd be working entirely remotely using secure communication systems they'd provide. The training materials arrived via encrypted file transfer, along with login credentials for the platforms I'd be moderating. David explained that the platforms use special browser technology to protect user privacy, which was why they couldn't be accessed through normal internet connections. He provided step-by-step instructions for setting up the necessary software. When I finally accessed the platforms, my first impression was how basic they looked compared to mainstream social media. Simple layouts, minimal graphics, text-based discussions organized into topic categories. The interface reminded me of internet communities from the late 90s, before companies had invested millions in sophisticated user experiences. The content itself was immediately concerning. I'd been expecting controversial political discussions or conspiracy theories, the sort of material that mainstream platforms restricted, but that wasn't necessarily illegal. Instead, I found discussions about topics that were clearly criminal in nature. Detailed guides for exploiting various systems, conversations about targeting specific individuals, even exchanges about coordinating illegal activities. When I raised concerns during my training, the senior moderator explained that their role wasn't to judge the legality or morality of what users discussed. The platforms existed to facilitate free expression in spaces where government surveillance and corporate censorship couldn't reach. Our job was simply to enforce the specific rules the platforms had established, not to act as moral arbiters or law enforcement. The rules themselves were surprisingly specific. No spam or commercial advertising, no revealing personal information about other users without permission, no coordinating attacks against the platforms themselves or their administrators. But almost everything else was permitted, including discussions of criminal activity, as long as they remained theoretical rather than active coordination. I was deeply uncomfortable with the distinction they were drawing, but the senior moderator emphasized that moderators who couldn't maintain professional distance from disturbing content wouldn't last long in the role. This work required accepting that facilitating free expression sometimes meant allowing discussions we personally found abhorrent. I convinced myself this was no different from the principle that defending free speech sometimes means protecting speech we disagree with. I wasn't endorsing what users discussed, just maintaining spaces where they could express themselves without censorship. My role was technical and professional, not moral or legal. The first few weeks of actual moderation work tested that rationalization severely. I reviewed hundreds of flagged posts and comments every day, making decisions about whether they violated the platform's specific rules. Most of the time, the violations were clear: spam, personal information being shared, direct threats against platform administrators. But I was also seeing content that was deeply disturbing. Detailed discussions about exploiting vulnerable people, guides for circumventing security measures and accessing systems without authorization, conversations about targeting specific individuals for harassment or worse, all technically within the platform's rules because they remain theoretical discussions rather than active coordination. I found myself removing spam and commercial advertising while allowing posts that discuss criminal activity in disturbingly specific detail. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming, but I kept telling myself I was just following the rules I'd been hired to enforce. I wasn't responsible for what users chose to discuss within those parameters. The breakthrough came about 3 months into the work when I recognized specific details in a discussion thread. Users were discussing a harassment campaign against a teacher in Norfolk, sharing her work address, her daily routine, even photographs of her home and car. The post technically didn't violate platform rules because they weren't coordinating attacks, just sharing information and discussing theoretical approaches. But I recognized the school mentioned in the discussion. It was where my sister's children attended, in a small town outside Kings Lynn. The teacher being discussed was someone I'd met at school events, a kind woman who taught primary school children and had never done anything to warrant the obsessive documentation these users were compiling. I realized I was moderating platforms that facilitated systematic harassment and stalking of real people, including people I knew personally. The theoretical discussions I was allowing weren't abstract debates about controversial topics. They were planning and intelligence gathering for criminal activity against identifiable individuals. I tried reporting the harassment campaign to David, explaining that users were clearly coordinating activity that would result in real harm to a specific person. He thanked me for the report, but explained that unless users explicitly coordinated illegal actions in their posts, the discussions fell within allowed parameters. The platforms existed to facilitate free expression, even when that expression involved sharing information about people who hadn't consented to being discussed. That response made me understand I wasn't moderating online communities to protect users from harm. I was maintaining spaces where people planned and coordinated criminal activity against vulnerable targets. The free expression we were facilitating was actually systematic intelligence gathering and harassment that destroyed real people's lives. I started paying closer attention to the platforms I was moderating, looking beyond individual rule violations to understand the broader context of what users were discussing. What I found was horrifying in its scope and organization. The platforms hosted extensive discussions about identifying vulnerable targets for various types of exploitation. Users shared techniques for surveillance, advice on circumventing security measures, even guides for psychologically manipulating specific types of victims. They coordinated activities without explicitly stating their criminal nature, using coded language and theoretical framing that technically didn't violate platform rules. One category of discussions focused on identifying and exploiting elderly people living alone. Users shared information about specific individuals, photographs of their homes, details about their daily routines. They discussed theoretical approaches for gaining access to properties, theoretical techniques for convincing people to provide financial information or access to their accounts. Another section dealt with targeting children through online spaces. Users shared information about children's social media accounts, their schools, their after-school activities. They discussed theoretical approaches for establishing contact, theoretical techniques for building trust with young people who might be isolated or vulnerable. I was looking at what amounted to criminal planning being conducted in plain sight, shielded by the pretense that these were merely theoretical discussions protected by principles of free expression. And I was the one ensuring these discussions could continue by removing spam and obvious rule violations, while allowing the substantive criminal content to remain. The teacher my sister knew was just one of hundreds of people being systematically targeted through discussions on the platforms I moderated. Each day, I reviewed posts documenting surveillance of specific individuals, sharing their personal information, discussing approaches for exploiting their vulnerabilities. But what made it unbearable was understanding that my moderation work was essential to the platform's operation. The constant spam, scams, and obvious rule violations would have made the platforms unusable if moderators like me weren't filtering them out. By removing the noise, I was making it easier for users to conduct their targeted harassment and criminal planning without distraction. I tried to refuse further work, but David made it clear that wasn't an option I could simply choose. I'd been working for the platforms for months, seeing everything users discussed, making decisions about what content should remain visible. I knew too much about how they operated and what they facilitated. Walking away would mean explaining to potential future employers why I'd left such well-paid work, and it would mean losing the substantial income I'd become dependent on. I was trapped by my own complicity. I couldn't report the platforms to authorities without admitting I'd been enabling criminal activity for months. I couldn't continue moderating without accepting that I was facilitating serious harm to real people. And I couldn't simply walk away without consequences from people who had extensive documentation of my involvement in maintaining these spaces. That's when I started documenting everything I saw on the platforms, taking screenshots and keeping detailed records of the criminal discussions I was being required to allow. I told myself I was preserving evidence for eventual reporting to authorities, but really I was just trying to feel less guilty about the harm I was enabling every day. The teacher in Norfolk ended up leaving her job after the harassment became unbearable. Users on the platform celebrated their successful campaign, discussing techniques they'd used and sharing lessons learned for future targeting. I read those celebration posts and knew I'd played a role in destroying a good person's career and sense of safety. I found other cases where people I'd allowed to be discussed on the platforms had subsequently been victimized. An elderly man in Somerset, whose information had been shared in those targeting discussions, was burgled shortly afterwards. A young mother in Wales, who'd been identified as vulnerable on the platforms, experienced systematic harassment that drove her from her home. Each case made it clearer that my moderation work wasn't just facilitating abstract discussions. It was enabling real criminal activity that destroyed real lives. The theoretical framing users employed to avoid explicit rule violations was just a linguistic shield that let them coordinate actual crimes, while I helpfully removed the spam and obvious violations that might have interfered with their planning. I tried contacting the police about what I'd discovered, but explaining my role proved impossible without admitting extensive complicity. I'd been moderating platforms for months, carefully removing content that violated specific rules while allowing criminal planning to continue unimpeded. My screenshots and documentation showed my intimate involvement in maintaining spaces where serious crimes were coordinated. The officer I spoke to was professional but frank about my position. I'd knowingly worked for platforms facilitating criminal activity. Accepting substantial payment for work I must have understood was enabling harm. Cooperation might be valuable for their investigation, but I shouldn't expect immunity from prosecution for my role in the operation. I was advised to stop moderating immediately and refuse further contact with the platform administrators. But David had already anticipated that possibility. I received messages explaining that moderators who caused problems for the platforms faced serious consequences. They had extensive records of my moderation decisions, including content I'd allowed to remain that had subsequently enabled criminal activity. If I tried to report them, they'd ensure authorities understood my active role in facilitating that activity. I realized I was being blackmailed with documentation of my own moderation work. Even though I'd been following the rules I'd been hired to enforce, the records showed me making decisions that allowed criminal planning to continue. They could present me as an active facilitator of the harm these platforms enabled. That's when the harassment started in earnest. I began finding my own personal information appearing on the platforms I'd been moderating. Users discussed my work history, my address, my daily routines. They shared photographs of my flat taken from outside, discussed theoretical approaches for accessing my home, even speculated about vulnerabilities that could be exploited. I was now being subjected to the same treatment I'd been enabling for months through my moderation work. Users were documenting my life with the same methodical precision they'd applied to all their previous targets, discussing approaches for ensuring my silence about what I'd seen on their platforms. The cognitive dissonance of seeing my own information being shared in spaces I was supposed to be moderating was overwhelming. I was expected to continue removing spam and obvious rule violations from discussions about targeting me, maintaining the platform's functionality, even as it facilitated my own harassment. I stopped logging into the moderation systems entirely, knowing that refusing to work would trigger the consequences David had warned about, but unable to continue enabling discussions that now directly threaten my own safety. Within days, I started receiving packages containing printed screenshots of moderation decisions I'd made, with annotations showing how those decisions had enabled specific criminal activities. The message was clear. They had comprehensive documentation of my complicity, and they'd use it to destroy my life if I caused them problems by reporting to authorities or refusing to remain silent about what I'd seen. That's when I left Norwich entirely, packing essential belongings and driving to Stoke-on-Trent, where I had no previous connections. I've been staying in this inadequate bedsit, avoiding digital traces and hoping I can disappear long enough to work out what to do next. But I know the platforms are still operating, still facilitating criminal planning and coordination, still enabling systematic targeting of vulnerable people. Other moderators have probably been recruited to replace me. People who make the same rationalizations I did about just enforcing rules and maintaining free expression. I think about that teacher in Norfolk, about the elderly man who was burgled, about all the other people whose lives were destroyed through discussions I allowed to remain visible. They trusted that online platforms had some responsibility to prevent coordination of criminal activity, that moderators would remove content that enabled serious harm. But I proved them wrong by carefully maintaining the platform's functionality, while allowing criminal planning to continue unimpeded. Every spam post I removed, every obvious violation I caught, it all made the platforms more effective at facilitating the criminal discussions I was required to ignore. The platforms taught me that moderation itself can be weaponized, that enforcing narrow technical rules while ignoring broader criminal context makes you complicit in whatever harm those platforms enable. that free expression principles can be exploited to shield criminal activity behind theoretical framing and coded language, and that once you've spent months moderating platforms you know are facilitating criminal activity, you become complicit enough that reporting them means destroying your own life along with exposing their operations. I suppose that's why I'm still sitting here in this freezing bedsit, rather than going back to police with all the evidence I preserved. Because I know that documentation implicates me as much as it exposes the platforms, and I'm not brave enough to face consequences for choices I made when I convinced myself I was just following the rules I'd been hired to enforce. All I can do is hope that someone else will eventually expose these platforms, that other moderators will find the courage I lack to report what they're enabling, despite the personal consequences, and hope that the people being targeted through discussions on those platforms find some way to protect themselves from criminal activity being coordinated in spaces that present themselves as merely facilitating controversial free expression, because the platforms are still operating, still recruiting moderators, still facilitating systematic targeting of vulnerable people. And I helped maintain them for months, carefully removing spam and obvious violations, while allowing criminal planning to flourish unchecked. There's something about being a creature of habit that feels comforting, isn't there? Knowing what you'll be doing on any given day, following the same routes, stopping at the same places, the predictability of it all. I used to think that made life easier, more manageable. I'd wake up at the same time each morning, take the same walk before breakfast, go through the same routines that had developed naturally over years of living alone. It felt safe, I suppose, structured. The kind of life where you don't have to think too hard about what comes next, because you've done it all 100 times before. I'm an occupational therapist, working with elderly clients at their homes across Hull and the surrounding areas. It's rewarding work, helping people maintain independence in their daily lives, adapting their environments to make things easier as mobility or cognitive function declines. I've been doing it for around 14 years now, long enough that I've developed quite set patterns in how I structure my days. I visit the same clients on the same days each week, take the same routes between appointments, stop at the same cafe for lunch most days because I know what I'll get, and it's convenient. I live in a terraced house near the city centre, bought it about 8 years ago when property prices were still reasonable. It's a nice enough area, quiet street, neighbours I recognise, but don't really know beyond polite nods when we're putting bins out. I've lived alone since I bought the place, prefer it that way honestly. After spending days helping people navigate challenging situations, there's something restorative about coming home to space that's entirely your own, where you can be completely yourself without having to maintain any professional demeanour. My routines at home are as predictable as my work schedule. Morning walk at 6:30, same route around the nearby park regardless of weather. Coffee from the same shop on the corner before I start seeing clients. Home by 6 most evenings, dinner around 7, usually something simple because I'm tired from the day. Television for an hour or so, then bed by 10 because I need proper sleep to function effectively in my job. Weekends follow their own patterns. Saturday morning shopping at the same supermarket, Sunday afternoon walk along the marina, that sort of thing. I never thought about how visible these routines were to anyone paying attention. Never occurred to me that predictability could be a vulnerability rather than just a comfort. Why would it? I'm not particularly wealthy, don't own anything especially valuable, live a quiet, unremarkable life helping elderly people maintain theirs. There's nothing about me that would make anyone think I'm worth paying attention to, nothing that would suggest I'm a target for anything more serious than maybe an opportunistic burglary. But apparently, that's not how these things work. Apparently, the very ordinariness of my life, the predictability of my routines, the fact that I live alone and follow the same patterns week after week, all of that made me exactly the sort of person someone was looking for. Not for anything I owned or any particular reason related to who I am, but simply because my life was documented and consistent enough to be useful to people I'd never meet, who had purposes I couldn't have imagined. It started, as far as I can tell, about 18 months ago, though I didn't know anything was happening at the time. I was just living my normal life, following my comfortable routines, completely unaware that someone was systematically documenting every aspect of my daily patterns. Where I went, when I went there, how long I stayed, what routes I took between locations. All of it recorded with precision that seems excessive until you understand what it was being used for. I first became aware something might be wrong when a colleague mentioned she'd seen me in a part of town I don't usually visit. She said she'd waved, but I hadn't seemed to notice, which was odd, because I'm generally quite observant about my surroundings. The problem was, I hadn't been in that area on the day she mentioned. I'd been visiting clients on the opposite side of the city, following my usual Thursday schedule. When I explained this, she seemed confused, but we both shrugged it off as a case of mistaken identity. Then it happened again, a few weeks later. A former client's daughter mentioned seeing me at the marina on a Sunday morning, said she'd been surprised because she knew I usually went there in the afternoons. Again, I hadn't been there that morning. I'd been at home doing housework, my typical Sunday morning routine. This time, the coincidence felt less comfortable, but I still assumed it was just someone who looked similar to me, being spotted in places I was known to frequent. The third incident was more unsettling. My neighbor, an older woman who lives 2 doors down and who I occasionally chat with when we're both outside, mentioned that she'd seen someone in my back garden late one evening. She'd been letting her cat out and noticed a figure standing near my back door, looking at the windows. She'd assumed it was me initially, but then realized the person was wearing different clothes than she'd seen me in earlier that day. By the time she thought to say something, the figure had left. That conversation made me properly uneasy. Someone in my garden, specifically, examining my windows. That wasn't a case of mistaken identity or coincidental resemblance. That was someone deliberately on my property, potentially trying to work out how to access my house. I checked all my locks that evening, made sure windows were secure, but I couldn't see any evidence of attempted entry or damage. I reported it to the police, more to have it documented than because I expected them to do much about it. They were sympathetic but honest about the limitations. Someone standing in a garden isn't itself a crime unless they're attempting to enter the property or causing damage. And by the time my neighbor mentioned it, whoever it was had long since left. They said they'd increase patrols in the area and advised me to contact them immediately if I noticed any further suspicious activity. Nothing obvious happened for a few weeks after that, and I started to relax slightly. Perhaps it had been someone genuinely confused about which house they were trying to visit, or a would-be burglar who'd moved on to easier targets after seeing my neighbor watching. I convinced myself it was an isolated incident that wouldn't be repeated. Then I started noticing small changes around my house. Nothing dramatic, just minor details that seemed slightly off. A plant pot on my back step moved a few inches from where I'd left it. The gate to my garden unlatched when I was certain I'd secured it. A bin moved from its usual position against the side wall. Each incident was small enough to dismiss as wind or cats or my own faulty memory, but together they created a pattern that felt deliberate. I became more vigilant, paying attention to exactly how I left things so I could be certain if they'd been disturbed. The disturbances continued, not frequently, maybe once a week or so, but consistent enough that I couldn't dismiss them as coincidence or imagination. Someone was accessing my garden regularly, moving small things, making their presence known in subtle ways. I installed a camera covering the back garden, one of those basic motion-activated security cameras that uploads footage to your phone. For the first few days, it showed nothing unusual. Just cats passing through, birds landing on the fence, the occasional fox at night. Then on the fourth night, around 2 a.m, it captured someone entering my garden through the back gate. The figure was dressed in dark clothes and moved carefully, checking the camera's position before doing anything else. They spent several minutes examining my back door and windows, trying handles, apparently checking if anything was unlocked. When everything proved secure, they took photographs of the locks and windows with their phone, taking their time to capture multiple angles. Then they left as quietly as they'd arrived, closing the gate carefully behind them. I took the footage to the police immediately. This time they treated it more seriously. Clear evidence of someone attempting to access my property, photographing security measures, behavior that suggested planning for future criminal activity. They assigned someone to investigate and asked if anything else unusual had happened recently. I mentioned the sightings of someone who looked like me in various locations, which I'd previously dismissed as a mistaken identity. The detective's expression changed when I mentioned that. She asked for specific details about when and where these sightings had occurred, who had seen me, what I'd been wearing according to witnesses. She seemed particularly interested in the timing and locations, making notes about my usual routines and when the supposed sightings had happened. A few days later, she contacted me again, asking if I'd be willing to let them check my house for surveillance equipment. That suggestion was disturbing in a way the garden intrusions hadn't been. The possibility that I'd been watched inside my own home without knowing it, that my private life had been observed and recorded. I agreed immediately, needing to know if my home had been compromised beyond just the external security concerns. The search took several hours. Specialists went through every room with detection equipment, checking for hidden cameras or recording devices. They found 3, one in my living room smoke detector, one hidden in the kitchen extractor fan, and one in my bedroom ceiling light. All of them had been in place for at least several months, recording and transmitting footage continuously. The detective explained what they believed was happening, though even now I struggle to fully comprehend it. My routines had been documented and sold on the dark web as part of what they called a comprehensive identity package. The surveillance footage, the photographs of me in various locations, detailed notes about my schedule and habits. All of it compiled into a profile that could be purchased by people interested in assuming someone else's identity, at least temporarily. The person who looked like me, who'd been spotted in various locations around Hull, had apparently purchased my identity profile. They'd studied my routines, my appearance, my typical clothing and behavior, until they could convincingly impersonate me in casual situations where detailed scrutiny wasn't likely. The sightings that had been reported to me were probably test runs, checking if they could pass as me in familiar locations without being challenged. The detective showed me the dark web marketplace where my profile was listed. It was organized like a professional service database, with categories for different types of identity profiles. People with established routines, predictable schedules, lives that could be temporarily borrowed for various purposes. My listing was categorized under solitary professionals with consistent patterns and minimal social oversight. The profile included everything someone would need to impersonate me convincingly in non-intimate situations. Photographs showing my appearance from multiple angles, including shots taken from the surveillance footage in my home. Detailed documentation of my daily routines, what I wore on different occasions, where I went and when. Notes about my mannerisms and behavior patterns based on analysis of the surveillance footage. Even information about my clients and work schedule, apparently gathered from observing my comings and goings over several months. The listing emphasized the stability and predictability of my routines, marketing that as valuable for buyers who needed to assume someone's identity for extended periods. It mentioned that I lived alone with minimal family contact, making me less likely to be immediately missed if someone was using my identity elsewhere. It noted that my work involved visiting clients independently, providing legitimate reasons for my presence in various locations at different times. The purchase history showed my profile had been bought by 4 different accounts. The detective explained that these profiles were valuable for various criminal purposes, creating alibis, accessing locations under false pretenses, evading law enforcement by using another person's identity and routine. Someone who looked reasonably similar to me could use my identity profile to be seen in places whilst crimes were being committed elsewhere, or to access locations they'd otherwise have no legitimate reason to visit. She walked me through what they'd learned about the impersonations that had occurred. The person my colleague had seen wasn't me, but someone using my profile who'd been establishing that they could pass as me in public. The sighting at the marina had been another test, checking if they could match my routine closely enough that people who knew me casually would mistake them for me. These weren't random acts. They were systematic preparation for using my identity for purposes I still don't fully understand. The investigation revealed a substantial operation. Hundreds of people had their routines documented and identity profiles created without their knowledge. Surveillance equipment installed during legitimate service visits or through other forms of access. Detailed observation of daily patterns over months or years. All of it compiled into profiles sold to people who needed to borrow someone else's identity temporarily for criminal purposes. The person caught in my garden on camera had been updating my profile with current information about my security measures. The marketplace offered profile refreshes as an additional service. Buyers could pay for updated intelligence if they needed current information, rather than potentially outdated details from when the profile was first created. The cameras in my house had been providing ongoing footage that kept my profile current and valuable. Several arrests were made, including the person who'd been caught on camera in my garden. But the identity profiles themselves had been widely distributed before law enforcement discovered the operation. My profile, along with hundreds of others, existed in private collections of people who downloaded it before the marketplace was shut down. The detective couldn't tell me who the 4 buyers were or what they'd use my identity for, only that investigations were ongoing. I had all the surveillance equipment removed and upgraded every security measure I could afford. Changed my locks, installed proper cameras covering all approaches to my house, started varying my routines deliberately to avoid being as predictable as I'd been. But the psychological damage was deeper than any physical security measure could address. Someone had been living as me, at least partially, walking through places I usually went, being seen by people who knew me, using my identity and routine for purposes I'd never know. My life had been borrowed without permission, my predictable patterns weaponized against me, my comfortable routines turned into vulnerabilities that strangers exploited for their own purposes. I moved house 6 months after discovering the identity profile, not just because of what had happened, but because I couldn't shake the feeling that someone still knew too much about my life there, my routines, my habits, my patterns, all of it documented in profiles that existed somewhere beyond my ability to control or delete. Even in a new location with deliberately varied patterns, I can't escape the knowledge that for months, someone studied me closely enough to impersonate me, that strangers borrowed my identity for purposes I'll never fully understand. The detective mentioned that this type of identity theft was increasingly common. Not financial identity theft, where someone uses your personal details to access accounts, but physical identity theft where someone becomes you in the real world for short periods. The dark web marketplaces facilitated this by providing detailed profiles of people with predictable, documented lives that could be temporarily borrowed. She explained that buyers often purchase multiple profiles, testing different identities in low-risk situations before using them for more serious purposes. My profile had been bought by 4 different accounts, meaning 4 separate people or groups had paid for detailed information about how to convincingly be me for limited periods, what they'd used it for, whether crimes had been committed under my identity, whether anyone had been harmed by someone pretending to be me. Those questions remained unanswered. I think about those 4 unknown buyers constantly. Who were they? Why did they need to borrow my identity specifically? What situations required them to appear to be a solitary occupational therapist with predictable routines living in Hull? Were they local, people I might have encountered, without knowing they'd studied footage of me sleeping and going about my private life? Or were they from elsewhere, using my profile for purposes that required temporary presence in this area? The uncertainty is corrosive. Not knowing what my identity was used for, whether crimes were committed while someone appeared to be me, whether people I interact with now might have previously encountered someone impersonating me. My comfortable routines, which had felt safe and manageable, had actually made me vulnerable to exploitation I'd never imagined possible. I still work as an occupational therapist, still help elderly clients maintain their independence. But I've learned that the independence I valued in my own life, the solitary routines, the predictable patterns, the life structured around familiar habits, created vulnerabilities that sophisticated criminals could exploit systematically. My identity was documented, packaged, and sold to people who needed to be someone else temporarily. And I discovered this only because one of them made mistakes that led investigators to me. The profile exists somewhere still. Months of surveillance footage showing my most private moments, detailed documentation of my routines and habits, photographs and analysis that allows someone who looks vaguely similar to me to convincingly impersonate me in casual situations. That information is outdated now that I've moved and changed my patterns, but it still exists in collections I'll never access, potentially being shared through networks I can't monitor. That's what I think about now when I see people following predictable routines, living solitary lives structured around familiar habits. Not that they're living comfortably within patterns that suit them, but that they might be creating comprehensive profiles of themselves without knowing it. That their predictability might be observed and documented by people who see routine as valuable intelligence, who understand that the most comfortable lives are often the most vulnerable to this particular type of exploitation. I was a creature of habit, and that made me a perfect target for identity theft I didn't know existed. My routines were borrowed. My life was temporarily lived by strangers. My identity became a product sold to people whose purposes I'll never fully understand. And somewhere out there, detailed documentation of who I was and how I lived still exists. A permanent record of vulnerabilities I can never completely eliminate. No matter how much I change or how carefully I vary my patterns now,